The contract arrived before breakfast. Alara had not eaten since the previous morning, but that was not the kind of detail anyone in the Voss household cared about right now. Her father stood at the dining room table with his back to her, his hands pressed flat against the wood, his shoulders curved inward the way they always did when he had already decided something and was only waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. She already knew. She had known since the night before when she had heard his voice through the study door, low and careful, the way it only ever got when he was talking to people who frightened him. The name Asheville had passed through that door like smoke. Alara set down the cup she was holding. It made a small sound against the kitchen stone. Her younger sister, Clara, was sitting at the corner of the table pretending to read, which meant she also knew and was too afraid to look up. "Father," Alara said. He turned around. Jeffrey Voss was not a cruel man. That was always the hardest part of it. He had kind eyes, the kind that creased at the corners when he laughed, and he had not laughed once in the past 14 months, not since the debt had grown past the point where his practice could absorb it, not since the man called Draven Asheville had purchased it from the original creditor. "Sit down," he said. She did not sit down. She had learned some time ago that sitting when someone told her to sit made the conversation go the direction they wanted it to go, and she needed this one to go where she could see it. "You sold the debt," she said. He looked at his hands. "I did not sell anything." "You transferred it." "It is not that simple." "Tell me which part is complicated," she said, and her voice came out level, which surprised her, because her heart was doing something strange in her chest, something fast and uneven that she did not entirely trust. Jeffrey Voss was a physician. He had spent 30 years diagnosing difficult things, which meant he was also very good at delivering them. He pulled out a chair and sat in it without using the table for support, which was how she knew he had rehearsed this. "The Duke requires a wife," he said. "He has agreed to clear the debt entirely, every coin, the house, the practice, Clara's school fees, all of it, in exchange for—" "For me," Alara said. He did not deny it. She stood very still for a moment. The kitchen window was behind her, and the morning light came in at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it look almost like something beautiful. She stared at a point on the wall above her father's left shoulder and did her breathing very carefully. "They say he is old," she said finally. "He is a duke, he is." "They say he is centuries old. I am asking if that is true." Her father's jaw moved. He pressed his lips together. "The Asheville line has ruled the northern keep for 300 years. Whether that means one man or many with the same name, I cannot." "You know what it means," Alara said. He looked at the table. She had always known what the Asheville name meant. Everyone knew, the way everyone knew about the depth of the northern river and the sharpness of the mountain passes. You did not need to have seen the thing to understand that it was real. The stories were too consistent, too detailed, too specific to be entirely invented. A man who did not age. A man whose keep sat above the frost line year-round and never went cold. A man who had buried 3 kings and 2 queens without changing expression at any of the funerals. A vampire, the common people said, though they did not use the word loudly. "He wants heirs," her father said, and the word landed the way he knew it would. It always did. Alara had been told she was barren at the age of 22. The physician had been very thorough about it. A condition of the blood, he had explained, with the particular kind of gentleness that is actually a door closing. Permanent, irreversible. She had sat in his examination room for a long time after he left, looking at the pale blue paint on the wall, learning the shape of a future that had just become smaller. She had made peace with it, or something close to peace. She had folded it into herself and kept walking, the way you do with things that cannot be changed. And now her father was telling a man who needed an heir that she was the answer. "He does not know," she said. Jeffrey Voss did not answer. "Father, does he know I cannot have children? The arrangement was made through intermediaries. The details of your—" he stopped, started again. He agreed to the terms before the specifics were discussed. She heard what he was not saying. He had not told them. He had signed the contract and taken the clearance documents and handed his eldest daughter to a centuries-old duke without mentioning the one detail that made the entire arrangement pointless. She did not scream. She had enough respect for Clara, who was still pretending to read at the corner of the table, to not scream in the kitchen. "When," she said. "The carriage comes in 4 days. 4 days, she repeated. The ceremony will be held at the keep. You will travel north with a small party. The Duke's people will meet you at the border. She looked at her father for a long time. He looked back, and in his eyes she could see the thing he could not say, which was that he was sorry, which was that he had no other answer, which was that he loved her and had done this anyway. Because love and desperation are not the same thing, and sometimes one wins over the other, and nobody comes out of it cleanly. I will need warm clothes, she said. She walked out of the kitchen. The next 4 days passed the way bad waiting always does, too slowly during the nights, and too fast during the mornings. Ilara packed with the careful thoroughness of someone who knew they were not coming back. She did not pack anything she thought she might want to remember. She packed things she thought she might need. Her medical books, because her father had trained her at his side since she was old enough to hold a bandage, and she was not prepared to become useless just because her address was changing. Her notebooks, 2 warm coats, one very practical and one slightly less so, because she was not entirely ready to surrender the last of herself to practicality. The small carved wooden box her mother had left her, which she put at the bottom of the bag without looking at it. Clara sat on her bed while she packed, and did not say the things she wanted to say, which was how Ilara knew they were important. You could refuse, Clara said on the 3rd night. No, Ilara said, I could not. You could run. Where would I go? And what would happen to you and father when I did? Clara looked at her hands. She was 16, with their mother's nose and their father's stubbornness, and she had been crying quietly for 3 days without once admitting it. The skin under her eyes had gone pink and tender. He is a monster, Clara said. Everyone says. Everyone says a great many things. They say he has never smiled, not once, not in all the times anyone has seen him. Then he and I will have at least one thing in common, Ilara said, and she meant it as a joke, and Clara did not laugh, and neither did she. The carriage came on a grey morning that suited the occasion. 2 of the Duke's men rode alongside it, in dark coats with a silver clasp at the collar that bore the Asheville mark, an angular shape, like a bird caught mid-turn, though on closer inspection it was something else entirely, something older. Ilara did not stare at the clasp. She kissed her father's cheek, held Clara for slightly longer than she intended to, and got into the carriage without looking back at the house. She looked forward instead. She had always found it easier to face things straight on. The road north took 2 full days. She slept in small inns, ate what was put in front of her, and read her medical books by candlelight until her eyes gave out. The Duke's men were polite in the rigid, professional way of people who have been told to be polite and are taking the instructions seriously. They did not attempt conversation. She did not request it. On the 2nd evening, the mountains appeared. She had known they were coming, had seen them on the maps her father kept rolled in his study, but the maps had not prepared her for the way they simply rose out of the horizon without introduction, massive and white-tipped and permanent in a way that made the carriage feel very small. The northern road wound upward through pine trees that grew tall and close together, and the air coming through the small window went cold enough to make her breath visible, and then colder still. The keep appeared at dusk. She had imagined something grim. She had imagined something dripping and dark, with a certain kind of theatrical grimness that matched the stories. What she saw was different. The keep was large, very large, made of grey stone that had aged into something almost silver in the low light. It sat on a ridge above the frost line, as they had said, but it did not look like a place of horror. It looked like a place that had been here a very long time and had stopped caring what anyone thought about it. The kind of permanence that isn't threatening, just honest. Torches burned in the courtyard when the carriage rolled through the gate. A woman met her at the door, the housekeeper, who introduced herself as Mrs. Calloway, with the brisk, competent manner of someone who has managed large households for so long that she has stopped distinguishing between tasks. She showed Ilara to rooms in the east wing that were cold but not cheerless, with good rugs on the stone floors and a fireplace that burned without being asked. The Duke, Ilara said, while Mrs. Calloway was showing her the wardrobe. He will meet you at the ceremony tomorrow, Mrs. Calloway said, without turning around. He requests you rest tonight. Does he? He does. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed. It was a good bed. She had not expected a good bed. She had not expected the room to be warm either, and it was warm, and that small detail was doing something unpleasant to her composure, because she had built her composure on the expectation of nothing good, and a small warm room with a good bed was making the foundation of it shiver slightly. She looked at the fire for a long time. She thought about the contract. She thought about her father's hands on the table. She thought about the physician's voice 3 years ago, gentle and closing, and about the future she had imagined since then, quiet and solitary and entirely her own. She thought about Clara's face at the door of the house. She thought about the word heirs, and what it meant to offer that word to a woman who could not fulfill it, and what it meant that she was here anyway, in a warm room in a vampire duke's keep, preparing to stand at an altar tomorrow and speak words that were, in the truest possible sense, a lie before they had even started. She was not afraid of the Duke. She was afraid of the look on his face when he found out what she was not. The ceremony the next morning was short. The Duke's court assembled in the great hall, which was as cold and grey and honest as the exterior of the keep, with no decoration that was not structural and no candles that were not necessary. Elara wore the dress Mrs. Calloway had provided, dark blue, which was sensible for a cold stone hall, well made without being excessive. She walked in alone. Draven Asheville was standing at the far end of the hall, and she walked toward him the way she had learned to walk toward difficult things, steadily, with her eyes open. He was tall, that was the first thing, taller than she had expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. He had the quality of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he needed and no more. Dark hair cut simply, a face that was not young and was not old and was something in between that made the word centuries feel suddenly uncomfortably real. His eyes from this distance were dark enough to be almost colorless. He was watching her walk toward him with an expression she could not read. She stopped in front of him. The officiant standing to the side began speaking. She watched Draven Asheville watch her and she thought, he does not know. He has signed a contract for something I cannot give him and he does not know, and when he finds out, every decision in that room will become very complicated very fast. The officiant reached the part where she was expected to speak. She spoke. Draven spoke. His voice, when it came, was low and even, the voice of someone who has learned that volume is for people who are not certain they will be listened to, and he was apparently always certain. The officiant pronounced the thing finished. Someone in the court applauded, not many, not warmly. Draven looked at her for one more moment, the expression on his face still unreadable, still that strange quality of attention that felt like being counted rather than seen. Then he turned and spoke quietly to the man at his right, and the assembly began to disperse, and Mrs. Calloway materialized at Elara's elbow to guide her back to the east wing. She did not look back. He did not look after her. That night in the east wing, she opened her medical books and did not read them. She sat with one open on her lap and stared at the fire and thought about the 4 grooves she had not yet seen in the keep's doorframe, and the question she was not yet brave enough to answer, which was not how long she could survive here. It was how long she could survive here before everything that had been kept quiet came rushing to the surface at once. The fire burned. Outside, the northern wind pushed against the stone walls of the keep, and the stone walls did not move, and somewhere in the long corridors above and below her, Draven Asheville went about whatever it was that centuries-old men did at night when they had just married a woman they had not bothered to look at, and the silence between them was enormous, and neither of them had yet done anything about it. She closed the book. She turned out the lamp. She lay in the warm bed in the cold stone keep and listened to the wind and thought, 4 days ago I was in a kitchen. 3 hours ago I was married. Tomorrow I will still be here, and the day after that I will still be here, and the thing I have not told him will still be between us like a wall. She thought about walls. She thought about how long walls could stand before something broke through them. She closed her eyes. Sleep, when it came, was deep and without dreams. The cold had a way of settling into the bones of the keep that no number of fires could entirely fix. Elara had noticed this on her first morning, when she rose before the sun and stood at the narrow window of her room and watched the gray sky lighten over the mountains with a kind of slow indifference, as though it had done this 10,000 times and found the process unremarkable. She had been awake for an hour already. She rarely slept past 4 in the morning since the debt had become serious, since the nights had begun carrying things in them that wouldn't leave when you opened your eyes. She had gotten used to the dark hours. They were at least honest. They didn't pretend things were fine. She dressed herself without calling for a maid. She had not asked for a maid and didn't intend to. She brushed her own hair and wound it up at the back of her head with the 2 pins she always used, the same 2 pins she had used for years. a small, ordinary fact of her life that she was holding onto with both hands because the rest of it was changing so fast she could feel the drag of it. She ate alone at the small table in her room. The food was brought by a girl named Nell, who was perhaps 15, with red hair and a quality of careful stillness that suggested she had been trained not to draw attention. She set the tray down, said, "Good morning, my lady," and left before Alara could decide whether to speak. "My lady." She tested the phrase in her mind. It didn't fit yet. She suspected it might never fit. She had always been Alara or Miss Voss or the physician's daughter or, for the last 3 years, the Barren one, though that was a phrase that was applied only behind backs, where people thought she couldn't hear it. She always heard it. She drank the tea. It was very good tea, which continued to be an irritating surprise. She had not built a story in which the Duke's Keep had excellent tea. After breakfast, she took her coat from the hook by the door and went out into the corridors. She explored because she needed to know where she was. This was practical, not curious. She had been dropped into an enormous stone building with no map and no introduction, and she was a physician's daughter, which meant she believed in knowing the lay of a place before the place became complicated. The east wing was quieter than the rest of the keep. She understood quickly that this was by design. The east wing was separated from the main household activity by 2 sets of heavy doors and a long corridor with high windows, and it had the feel of somewhere that had been arranged for a person who was expected to stay in it. She walked through it once, noting the rooms: a sitting room, a study with empty shelves, a smaller room that might have once been a nursery and had clearly not been used in a long time. She did not go back to the sitting room. She pushed through the heavy doors into the main corridor. The keep opened up. It was larger than it appeared from outside, which was an architectural trick she could appreciate even while it was disorienting. The main corridor ran the full length of the east and west wings and fed into a central hall, off which branched a dozen other passages, a wide stone staircase, and several closed doors that had the quality of being very deliberately closed. She met 3 members of the household staff in the first 10 minutes. They all greeted her with the same careful, professional politeness as Mrs. Calloway and Nell, and none of them gave her any information she hadn't already extracted from the layout of the corridors themselves. She did not see the Duke. She had not seen him since the ceremony. She had, in her own way, expected this. He had made it very plain that she was a transaction that had been completed. He would not revisit it for sentimental reasons because men like him did not have sentimental reasons for revisiting transactions. She understood this. She had arranged herself around it the way she arranged herself around most hard things. She was standing at the window at the far end of the main corridor, looking out at the courtyard below and the mountains beyond, when she heard footsteps that were different from the household staff's footsteps. Not louder, the opposite, quieter than anyone's footsteps should reasonably be in a stone corridor wearing boots. She registered the absence of sound before she registered anything else. She did not turn around immediately. She had a policy of not turning around immediately. It gave her a moment to arrange her face. When she did turn, Draven Asheville was standing at the far end of the corridor, perhaps 30 feet away. He had stopped walking. He was looking at her with the same unreadable quality she had noticed at the ceremony, that sense of being counted, of being information gathered rather than a person regarded. He was wearing a dark coat and no ceremony, which was a strange relief. They looked at each other across 30 feet of corridor for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. "You are exploring," he said, the same low, even voice it carried without effort. "I am learning the building," she said. It seemed practical. Something in his expression shifted, not much, the smallest possible adjustment like a calculation revised. "The east wing was prepared for you," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I also noticed it has everything necessary and nothing informative. I prefer to know where I am." He looked at her for another moment. "The library is on the 3rd floor, west corridor, 2nd door on the right. The kitchens are accessible from the lower hall." He paused. "The north tower is closed. The lock is in poor repair and the stairs are unsafe." He said this the way people say things that are true but not complete. She filed it. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head very slightly, turned, and walked back down the corridor. His footsteps were still barely audible. She watched him go and thought about the north tower and its conveniently poor lock, and decided she would leave that for a different day. She found the library. It was, against all expectation, the most honest room she had found so far. 3 walls of shelves from floor to ceiling, filled with books in no particular order, which meant they had been read and replaced by someone who valued reading over organization, which was a character detail she had not anticipated. 2 chairs near the window, a reading lamp on an iron stand, a small table with a ring on it from many years of cups set down. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went in and ran her finger along the spines until she found something she didn't already know, and she sat in the chair by the window, and for the first time since the carriage had pulled away from her father's house, she felt her shoulders drop from where they had been living, pressed against her neck. She read until the light failed, and the keep, stone and old and unreadable as its master, settled around her into a silence that was not entirely unfriendly. The night of the blood moon was not announced. No one in the keep mentioned it. No one warned her that the moon on the 3rd night of her marriage would rise already red, as though something had bled into the sky from the wrong side of the horizon. She discovered it herself, waking at 2 in the morning to a strange quality of light coming under the gap at the bottom of her curtains, a dull red warmth that was wrong in the way that things are wrong when they belong to the natural world but have slipped briefly out of its usual rules. She went to the window. The moon was enormous, red and round and low over the mountains, the kind of moon that would have sent her father's more superstitious patients to lock their doors and light their lamps, the kind the old books called a covenant moon, a blood moon, a moon that older cultures had understood as the mark of a threshold, a moment between what had been and what would come next. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to bed because she was a physician's daughter and she did not assign extra meaning to astronomical events, however striking. She did not know, lying in the dark and listening to the wind, what was happening elsewhere in the keep at that same moment. She would not know for weeks. Draven Asheville had spent the 3 days since the ceremony doing what he always did, which was working. He managed a duchy, which meant there were correspondence and land disputes and trade negotiations and border tensions, and a dozen other things that arrived daily in sealed envelopes, each one demanding something from him. He handled them efficiently, as he had for 3 centuries, with the kind of thoroughness that comes not from diligence, but from having done a thing so many times that efficiency has become simply the shape of how you do it. He had given the marriage arrangement a certain amount of thought before agreeing to it. Not a great deal. He was not a man who over-examined necessary decisions, but some. He needed an heir. The Asheville line required continuation, and while he himself did not age and would not die of ordinary causes, the legal and political structure of the duchy demanded a named successor, a recognized heir, someone who could occupy the seat in those decades when he found it useful to be officially absent from public life. The Voss woman was from a respectable family, educated, reportedly composed. The arrangement cleared a debt that had been creating political noise in the southern quarter. It was a practical solution to 2 separate problems, which was exactly the kind of solution he preferred. He had not thought about her much beyond that. He had noticed at the ceremony that she walked toward him without any of the particular quality of terror that some of his previous proposed arrangements had carried. She had looked at him the way you look at something you are calculating the weight of, which was interesting. He had filed it and moved on. He was in his study on the 3rd night when the blood moon rose. He was aware of it immediately. He was always aware of such things, in the same involuntary way that he was aware of rain coming before it arrived, or the shift in air pressure that preceded a mountain storm. The moon's rise moved through him like a low sound, a vibration below hearing, and he set down his pen and sat very still for a moment. It had been a very long time since a blood moon. He remembered the last one. He remembered what they meant for someone like him, not the superstitions of the common stories, not the dramatic transformations the old village tales described. Those were stories built on misunderstanding, on the very human habit of making monsters comprehensible by making them theatrical. The truth was quieter and in its own way stranger. A blood moon was a convergence, a moment where something old and latent in the blood, the particular quality of what he was, the thing 3 centuries of existence had woven into every part of him, surfaced closer to the skin. It was not a weakness. It was not a vulnerability. It was something more like a tide, a natural force that arrived on its own schedule and had to be moved through rather than fought. He had moved through many of them alone. He sat in his study until midnight. The moon's influence was a pressure at the back of his thoughts, behind his temples, in the bones of his hands. He poured himself a glass of the dark red liquid from the decanter on his shelf and drank it steadily, an old practice, an anchor. He had rituals for these nights. He had done this before. What he had not done before was have another person in the building who was, technically, his. This was an abstract thing. He was not the kind of man who used that word to mean possession. He had been married once before, 2 centuries ago, briefly, in a political arrangement not unlike this one, and the woman had died of a fever 3 years in, and he had buried her with full ceremony and returned to his work, and the grief had been real but contained. The way grief is when the relationship was always more arrangement than intimacy. The point was not possession. The point was proximity. The point was that the blood moon's pressure worked differently when there was another person in the building whose heartbeat he could hear. He could hear all heartbeats within a certain range. It was one of the practical facts of what he was, not mystical, simply physiological. The way a dog's hearing is not supernatural but merely differently calibrated. Most heartbeats were ambient noise, background easy to filter. He was not filtering hers. This was irritating. He refilled the glass. He picked up the document he had been reviewing before the moon rose. He read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing it. Her heartbeat was steady, slightly elevated from its sleeping rate, which meant she was awake. He knew she had gone to the window. There had been a shift in the ambient sound of the east wing, the particular acoustic signature of the heavy curtains being drawn back. She had looked at the moon, he supposed. Then she had returned to bed because the heartbeat had settled again. He did not know why he was tracking this with such attention. He set down the document. He stood and went to the window and looked at the moon himself for the first time that evening. It sat heavy and red over the mountains, the kind of red that was not alarming to someone who had seen many centuries of moons, but was still striking, still the particular shade of something old reasserting itself. Something moved through him then, not thought, not emotion in any recognizable form, something more like a current, the kind of internal shift that 300 years of existence had taught him to pay attention to without immediately categorizing, because immediately categorizing things was how you missed what they actually were. He stood at the window for a long time. He did not go to the east wing. He did not do anything at all, except stand there until the moon moved higher and its color cooled, and the pressure in his blood began to ease, the tide retreating back to where it lived, below the surface, where he could manage it. Eventually, he returned to his desk. He did not sleep that night. He rarely slept, another practical fact, not a dramatic one. He worked through the small hours as he usually did, methodically, without rush. He wrote 7 letters, settled a land dispute by correspondence, reviewed the trade agreement that had been waiting for his signature for 3 weeks. He did not think about the east wing. By morning, the blood moon was gone, and the sky was its ordinary gray, and the mountains were their ordinary white, and he went to his morning meeting with his steward with his usual focused efficiency, and nothing about him suggested that anything in the previous 12 hours had been unusual. He did not notice, because there was no reason he would have noticed, that his veins ran slightly warmer than they had the day before. He did not notice because it was a small difference, and he was a thorough man but not an obsessively self-monitoring one, and because 300 years of existence had given him a certain confidence in his own stability. He did not notice. 3 weeks later, Ilara Asheville, technically, though she hadn't quite settled into that name, woke on a Tuesday morning and was immediately, comprehensively sick before she reached the bathroom. She sat on the cold floor afterward with her hand flat against the stone and thought, "That is extremely interesting." She was precise about her own body in the way that people with medical training tend to be, not anxious, just attentive, the way you are when you've spent years learning that symptoms are information and information is what you work with. She sat on the floor and gathered information. Nausea, specifically morning nausea, which was a distinction that mattered. The severity of it, not a passing discomfort, something with more force than that, something insistent. The fact that it had arrived abruptly rather than gradually, which again was a distinction that mattered. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She sat on the floor for quite a long time. Then she got up, washed her face, and went and sat on the edge of her bed. She sat there for the better part of an hour, thinking with the particular quiet intensity that her father had always called her best quality, and that she had always privately considered simply the way her brain worked, not outstanding, just thorough. The physician who had declared her barren 3 years ago had been very specific. A condition of the blood, he had said, permanent. She had believed him because he had been her father's colleague for 15 years, and because the diagnosis had been delivered with the kind of careful detail that suggested someone who knew what they were talking about, and because she had had no reason at the time to disbelieve it. She was now sitting on a bed in the northern keep after a blood moon, reconsidering this with great focus. She was not going to assume, she was trained not to assume. One bout of morning nausea was not a diagnosis. It was a single data point, and she needed more data before she drew any conclusion. She was also not going to panic, because panic was not useful. She dressed, ate what she could manage, and spent the morning in the library reading everything it had on the subject of blood moon events and their documented effects on human physiology, which was not much, because the keep's library was rich on political history and classical philosophy and curiously thin on medical scholarship. She shifted her reading to the section on Asheville family history, which was richer. What she found there was not frightening exactly. It was more startling than frightening. It was the kind of information that lands and then sits very still in your chest while you decide what to do with it. She closed the book. She sat with both hands flat on the table. She looked at the candle burning in the iron holder on the shelf and thought about blood moons and old bloodlines and the particular specificity of the physician's diagnosis 3 years ago. And she thought about the keep's warmth, which was still something she could not entirely explain. And she thought about the man 2 wings away who did not know she was sitting in his library having this thought. She was not going to tell him. Not yet. She needed to be certain first. She needed more data, more days, more mornings. She needed to know before she walked into a conversation with a centuries-old duke who had married her for an heir she could not provide, and then tell him that the landscape of that arrangement might have just shifted in a direction neither of them had anticipated. She needed to be very sure. She opened the book again. And the morning nausea the following day was worse, and the day after that worse still, and the information gathered itself into a pattern that she stared at from her window in the east wing, hands pressed to her ribs, breathing very carefully, thinking about walls and what happens when they break. She could hear distantly from somewhere in the corridors above her the sound of the Duke's measured footsteps, the sound of a man who moved through his own home with absolute certainty because it had been his home for centuries and he had never had reason to feel otherwise. She thought about what she was carrying. She thought about what it would mean. She thought about the look her father had given her from across the kitchen table, the look that said, "I am sorry," and I had no other answer. And she thought about how that look was going to be replaced, eventually, soon, by the expression of a man who had been given everything he needed and did not yet know it. She pressed her hand flat against herself. All 3 the book had suggested, in lines she had read 3 times to be sure. All 3. She stood at the window and breathed. The book had a title that she had not initially paid attention to, something in an old form of the northern language that she could only partially read, but the section she had found was in plain current language, and it had been precise. The Asheville Convergence, it called the blood moon event. A periodic amplification of the line's specific properties, most pronounced in the first generation, reducing with each subsequent one. The text was old, written in a careful hand that had not rushed, and it described in clinical language several effects on those in close proximity to the head of the Asheville line during such a convergence. Close proximity had been the phrase that had stopped her. She had not been in close proximity. She had been in the east wing, 2 sets of heavy doors and a long corridor. She had looked at that phrase for a very long time. The book used the word proximity to mean within the same building, within the range of the bloodline's natural influence. It had not meant the same room. It had not meant the same floor. It had meant present. In the same dwelling, during the activation of a 300-year bloodline's most amplified event. She read the next section. Then she read it again. The effects on a person already predisposed. The text used a complicated old word that roughly translated to susceptible, could include a reversal of certain blood-based conditions, a correction of what the blood had gotten wrong. The text was careful to say this was not universal, not guaranteed, not even documented in more than a handful of cases across the keep's history. A handful of cases. She looked at the fire. She thought about the physician's diagnosis 3 years ago, a condition of the blood. What if the condition itself was the thing that had been corrected? What if the blood had been the variable, not the permanent state? This was a significant thing to be sitting with alone in a library with no one to discuss it with, because the only person in the building who might have any useful information about blood-moon convergences was the Duke, and she was not currently ready to have that conversation. She thought about her father, specifically the moment she had asked him if the Duke knew she was Barren, and the way he had not answered, and what that non-answer had set in motion. There was a particular irony available to her here if she wanted it. She did not particularly want it. What she wanted was certainty, more days, more mornings, something concrete enough to stand on before she did anything else. She went to dinner that evening in the main hall, which she had begun doing every third day or so, because eating in her room indefinitely felt like something she was not willing to concede. The Duke was there. He often was, though they had exchanged perhaps 40 words total in the time she had been in the keep, and they had not been intimate words. They had been the words of two people learning where the edges of each other's space were. He was reading at the table. She had noticed he often was. She sat across from him and accepted the plate that was brought to her, and she ate carefully because her stomach was still unreliable, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything. Then he said, without looking up from the page, "You have been in the library." It was not a question. "I have," she said. "The old section," he said, not a question either. The knowing quality of it was almost impressive. She supposed that when a library was yours and you were 300 years old, you could probably tell which books had been recently handled by which particular kind of dust disturbance. She said, "I found it informative." He turned a page. "It is the most accurate account of the history available in the keep," he said. "Some of the early sections are in Old Northern, which requires translation." "I know," she said. "I could read most of it." He looked up then, just briefly. Not with surprise exactly, but with that quality of slight adjustment she had noticed once before, a calculation revised. "Your father's education," he said. "My father's education and my own stubbornness," she said. Something at the very corner of his mouth moved, the smallest possible thing. She wasn't certain she hadn't imagined it. He returned to his page. She ate her dinner. Outside, the mountains were dark and white-tipped and enormous, and the moon was ordinary tonight, pale and small, and the keep was warm around them both in the way that she still hadn't fully accounted for, and somewhere in her chest, 6 weeks after a blood moon that no one had announced, something she hadn't dared name yet was making itself known in ways she could no longer reasonably ignore. She set down her fork. She looked at the fire. She thought 3 more days, give it 3 more days and then decide what to do with this. She glanced across the table. He was still reading. His profile in the firelight was that same quality of not young and not old, and his hands on the book were still, and he had the concentrated quiet of someone who was never not thinking about something, and she thought about the fact that she was currently sitting 6 feet away from him with information that would change every arrangement between them, and saying absolutely nothing about it. She thought about honesty, she thought about strategy, she thought about the distinction between the two and when the distinction mattered. She thought 3 more days. She picked up her fork. On the 43rd morning, Mrs. Calloway heard it first. The housekeeper was on her way from the kitchen corridor to the linen room when the sound came from the east wing, not loud, but unmistakable to a woman who had managed households long enough to know every sound a house could make, and to understand the difference between the ordinary ones and the ones that required a response. She changed direction without hesitating. She reached the east wing and knocked twice on the bedroom door, and when the answer did not come quickly enough, she opened it with the ring of keys she wore at her hip, and she found Alara on the floor of the washroom, one hand braced against the wall, her face the particular color that Mrs. Calloway associated with mornings that were about to become very complicated. "Up you come," Mrs. Calloway said, and helped her to the bed and brought water, and did not ask any questions that weren't immediately practical, which was why Alara did not particularly try to redirect her. She sat on the bed and drank the water in small sips and looked at the wall. "This has been happening for how long?" Mrs. Calloway asked. 6 weeks, Alara said, because there was no useful point in lying to a woman who was going to reach her own conclusions regardless. Mrs. Calloway looked at her with steady gray eyes that had seen, Elara suspected, most things that a large household in the north could produce over a long period of time. "I will send for Dr. Harwick," Mrs. Calloway said. "I am myself a physician's daughter," Elara said. "I am quite capable of drawing my own conclusions." "And have you?" Mrs. Calloway said, in a tone that was not unkind but was not leaving room for evasion either. Elara set down the cup. "I need to speak with the Duke," she said. Mrs. Calloway looked at her for one more moment, absorbing this with the professional composure that was her most reliable quality. Then she said, "I will let him know," and left the room. Elara sat on the edge of the bed. She had decided in the small hours of the previous night that she could not wait any longer, not because she was certain had been for some time, but she had kept finding reasons to delay, because certainty was one thing and walking into a room with it was another. She had delayed because she was afraid of the specific way this news would land, and what it would do to the arrangement between them, and what it would do to her. She was still afraid of those things. She was walking into the room anyway. She dressed carefully, not elaborately. She was not going to pretend this was a formal occasion, and anyway elaborate dress had never been her approach to anything. She put on the dark coat she liked, the practical one, and she tied her hair back, and she stood at the mirror for a moment and thought about what her face was doing and decided it was doing as well as could be expected. She went to the study. He was there. He was always in the study by 8 in the morning. The door was open, which was unusual. It was usually pulled to, not fully closed, but not open. She thought Mrs. Calloway had already told him something, not everything, but that she was coming. She went in. Draven was standing at the window with his back to her. He turned when she entered, and the thing she noticed immediately was that he was not sitting down, which meant he was also treating this as something that required the particular alertness of being on his feet. She did not sit either. They stood 8 feet apart, and she said before she could arrange it more carefully, "I am expecting children." The word children, not a child, because she had made a decision at 4 in the morning that she was not going to soften this into smaller pieces and deliver it gradually. She was not going to give him the pregnancy first and the number later. She was going to say it the way it was. He did not move. She watched his face. She had become, in the weeks she had been in the keep, something of a student of his face, precisely because it gave so little away, and that itself was information about where the things he didn't show were being stored. Right now, what she saw was a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. Ordinary stillness was the absence of unnecessary motion. This stillness was something that had stopped mid-thought. "Children," he said. Not a question, repetition, processing. 3, she said. "The physician would need to confirm, but I have enough medical education to be confident in that number. 3 heartbeats. I have been listening for them for 2 weeks. He looked at her. Something was happening in his expression that she could not fully interpret, but that had the quality of a man who has been told something that rewrites several things at once. "You were declared barren," he said. "I was told I was barren," she said, "by a physician who was, as I now believe, not acting in good faith." She paused. "I know that the terms of the arrangement between your household and my father's did not include this disclosure. I know the contract was signed without it being raised." She stopped. She let that sit. He let it sit too, for a moment that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. "Your father," he said, "he knew." "Yes," she said. She was not going to make excuses for her father. He had done what he had done for the reasons he had done it, and she had accepted the shape of that. She was not going to ask the Duke to accept it on her behalf. That was not how she operated. Draven walked from the window to his desk. He didn't sit at it. He stood behind it with both hands flat on the surface, and it was the same posture her father had used on the morning with the contract, which she found briefly striking. He said 3. "Yes." He looked at his hands, then he looked at her. She looked back. "Sit down," he said, not as an instruction. The tone was different from his usual economy. There was something in it that was almost, not quite, but almost the suggestion of someone who needed the person in front of him to be positioned somewhere stable before the next part of the conversation. She sat. He remained standing. He moved around the desk and stood near the fireplace, which put him at an angle from her rather than directly across, and she thought that was probably deliberate, that he was giving them both slightly less direct exposure to each other while they processed this. "The blood moon," he said. "Yes," she said. "I read about it in the library, the old section." He looked at the fire. "You read quickly." "I had motivation," she said. He almost did it again, that smallest possible movement at the corner of his mouth. She was more sure of it this time. "The diagnosis," he said. "The physician who declared you barren, you said not acting in good faith. My father received the debt from his original creditor approximately 14 months ago. I have since learned, and I believe you already know this, that the debt was structured by a house that wished to establish leverage over my father's household. The physician who saw me 3 years ago was in the employment of that same house." Draven went very still again. This stillness was different from the first one. This one had an edge to it. "Who?" he said. Just the one word, but the quality of it. "I don't yet have a name," she said. He turned from the fire and looked at her directly, and she held the look, because she had decided some time ago that she was not going to be the one to look away first in rooms like this. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but there was something moving in them that hadn't been there at the ceremony, something with more weight to it. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "I needed to be certain," she said. "I am not in the habit of raising alarms before I have the information to support them." He said nothing for a moment. "Then, are you well physically?" The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, it was in fact exactly the appropriate question for this moment, but because it came from a man she had categorized, fairly or not, as someone who did not ask personal questions. She adjusted the categorization. "I am managing," she said. "The mornings are difficult, I am otherwise functional." "You will see Harwick," he said. It was not quite a request and not quite an order. Something in between, which she thought was probably as close to concern as his current vocabulary contained. "I will see Harwick," she said without arguing about it, because she had already decided she would, and there was no point in performing resistance she didn't feel. He nodded. He walked back to the window. His hands were behind his back now, a posture she had not seen before, which she added to her inventory. She waited. 3, he said again quietly to the window. Not to her, to himself, the repetition of it, like something he was turning over and over to find its actual shape. She watched him and said nothing, because this was the kind of silence that needed to run its own course, and because she had enough experience with rooms where enormous things had just been placed on a table to know that the first person to fill the silence usually wasn't the one who needed to. He was quiet for a long time. Then he turned around. His expression had settled into something that wasn't readable exactly, but was different from the emptiness he usually presented. There was something behind it, pressed to the glass. "The east wing is insufficient," he said. "I will have the heirs' quarters prepared." She looked at him. She thought about the east wing, its careful separation, its 2 sets of heavy doors and long corridor, its quality of somewhere arranged for a person expected to stay in it. She thought about what it meant that he was moving her closer. She said, "The east wing is fine for now." He looked at her for a moment. "It is too far from the main household." "I am aware of the distance," she said. "I am also aware that we have a great many things to sort out before we renegotiate geography." Another calculation revised, she could see it. "What things?" he said. She looked at him calmly. "The house that arranged my father's debt, the physician, the fact that I have been here 6 weeks and have been carrying news that changes your succession plan, and we have barely spoken 20 sentences to each other. The fact that we are about to navigate something very large and quite complicated, and at present have no foundation for doing it." He was quiet. "The east wing is fine," she said again. "What is not fine is that we are strangers, and that is a problem we should address." She stood. He watched her stand without moving. "I eat in the main hall most evenings," she said. "You are usually there. I would like to actually speak from now on. I believe it would be useful." She walked to the door. He said nothing until she reached it. Then, "Alara." She stopped. It was the first time he had used her name. She turned. He was still by the window, hands now at his sides, and he had the look of a man standing on the edge of something he had not expected to be standing on, looking at it. 3, he said one more time, and there was something in the way he said it this time that was entirely different from the first two. Something that had moved past calculation entirely and arrived somewhere she didn't yet have a word for. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "3." She went back to the east wing. The corridor was very cold. She walked through it with her hands at her sides and her chin up, and when she reached her room she sat on the bed and put her hands over her face for a moment, not crying, just letting her face do what it had been carefully not doing for the past 30 minutes, and then she took them down and breathed and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere above her, in the main corridor of the keep, 4 grooves appeared in a door frame made of stone. She didn't hear it happen, but she felt the faint vibration of it through the floor, and she thought, all right then. All right. Dr. Harwick arrived the next morning. He was a small, precise man with the particular manner of someone who has spent a career in service to a household where precision was not optional. He greeted Alara with professional courtesy, conducted his examination with thoroughness and without commentary, and then sat across from her at the small table in her room and looked at his notes for a moment. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked up. 3 is uncommon. "I am aware. Triplets in the normal sense present certain considerations. Triplets in the Asheville line present additional ones." He chose the word additional with a careful quality that suggested entirely unprecedented within my living experience was what he actually meant. "The books in the library are thin on medical scholarship," she said. "They are," he agreed. "The previous cases were documented 3 generations back. I have the records in my office. I will bring them to you." He paused. "The Duke has asked me to report directly to him as well." "Of course," she said. Harwick looked at her with the assessing quality of a physician who had just revised his understanding of a patient's composure. He had clearly expected some reaction to this. "I am not going to try to control information flow in this household," she said, reading his expression. "We are past the point where that serves anyone." He nodded slowly. "How much do the records say," she asked, "about the triplets, about what they are?" He was quiet for a moment. "The records say they will be healthy," he said. "They say they will be strong. They say," he stopped, started again more carefully. "They say that what they carry from the Asheville line and what they carry from their mother will not cancel each other out. The 2 bloodlines will coexist in them. What that looks like in practice, I cannot predict from 3-generation-old notes." "But healthy," she said. "All indications," he said, "all 3. She let out a breath she had been holding longer than she realized. "The mornings," she said. "Will ease by the 4th month," he said. "Keep eating, small amounts frequently, stay warm, come to me with anything that changes." He stood, gathered his bag. "And rest," he added with the tone of a man who knows perfectly well he is telling a woman who does not rest to rest. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the window, to the gray mountains and the cold, clear sky, and she sat with the word healthy, all 3 of them healthy, and let it fill the room for a moment before she did anything else at all. Healthy. All 3. She had not let herself want this too much these past weeks. She had been very careful with wanting. She had good reasons to be careful with wanting, built over 3 years of a future that had been told to her in a physician's careful, closing voice. She was not accustomed to the thing you couldn't have arriving anyway, sideways, on a blood moon, in a cold stone keep, married to a man she had first spoken to 4 days after signing a contract. She sat with it. She let it be real for one moment fully, without managing it. All 3 healthy. Here. Then she picked up her coat and went to the library, because she still had things to learn, and learning was how she moved through things, and there were 3 lives inside her that were going to need her to have done the learning. Draven found her there 2 hours later. She did not look up when the footsteps came, his footsteps, barely there, but she had learned to catch the small difference. She finished the line she was reading and then looked up. He was standing in the doorway, not in the room, in the doorway. She had noticed this was a pattern with him. He stood at the edge of spaces rather than simply entering them, particularly hers. "Harwick has spoken to you," she said. "He has," Draven said. She marked her page. She waited. He came into the room then and stood near the shelf and looked at the book she'd been reading, which was open to a section on inherited traits in bloodlines. His expression registered this with that slight adjustment she had started to watch for. I found it on the third shelf, she said. The spine is worn, someone has read it many times. My father, he said, he was interested in the subject. She turned the book so the page faced him. It says the coexistence is stable, she said, your line and mine. It says the children will be, she stopped, because the word the book used was luminous, which was not a medical word, but it was the word the text used, and she wasn't ready to give it to him yet in this room when they were still figuring out how to occupy the same space without it being awkward. Remarkable, she said instead. He looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked at her. The windows were tall and gray-skied, and the fire was burning, and the library was the warmest room in the keep, and they were standing in it 3 feet apart, and she thought, 6 weeks ago you did not know my name, and I did not know yours, and now here we are with 3 lives in common and nowhere near enough conversation behind us for the weight of it. You said, he started, then yesterday. You said we should speak. I did, she said. He looked at the fire, a small muscle in his jaw moved. I am not, he said and paused, and she waited, accustomed to this kind of conversation. Nor am I, she said. I suggest we both find the accustomization in progress to be acceptable given the circumstances. He looked at her. This time she was almost certain about the corner of his mouth. Ask me something, she said, something real. I will answer it, and then I will ask you something and you will answer it, and we will do that until the library is dark. That is how people who need to know each other begin. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Are you frightened? She considered this. Not of what you are, she said. Not of the keep, not of the children, she paused. I am frightened of having people I cannot afford to lose. I have not had that in a very long time. He looked at her. Your turn, she said. He said slowly, as though choosing from a very long list. I have not spoken about anything except the duchy in 2 years, not genuinely. That is not a question, she said. No, he said, it is not. He sat down in the chair on the other side of the table. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the northern wind moved through the pines, and the mountains sat in their permanent cold, and the keep was warm. And they began, slowly and without grace, the very first real conversation. He did not move to the heir's quarters. He moved his work. Ilara noticed it on the 4th morning, after their conversation in the library. She came out of the east wing at her usual early hour, and found a correspondence clerk in the corridor that connected the east wing to the main hall, setting up a small table with an organized precision that suggested he had been given specific instructions about where it should go and what should be on it. She stopped. The clerk looked up, said, Good morning, my lady, and returned to the precise arrangement of papers. She continued walking, and noted as she passed the main study that the large desk inside was lighter than it had been the previous week, certain papers gone, certain items relocated. She did not say anything about it to anyone. At breakfast, she sat in the main hall and Draven came in at 7, which was unusual. He generally came in at 8. He sat at the table with his correspondence and read through it while she ate, and the table between them had the same quality it always had, present, manageable, the distance of 2 people who have decided to work out the distance rather than be managed by it. After 20 minutes he said, without looking up, There is a dispute in the south quarter. I will be occupied most of the day. I will be in the library, she said. He nodded. That was the whole exchange. But the next morning the clerk was still in the corridor. And the morning after, Draven came to the library at 4 in the afternoon, which was where she was, and he sat down at the other chair without announcing himself, and opened his correspondence, and they occupied the same room for 2 hours without exchanging a single word, and it was the most comfortable 2 hours she had spent in the keep so far. She thought about this afterward, about the strange specific comfort of someone choosing to be in the same room without requiring anything from you. It was the opposite of the East Wing's careful isolation. It was the opposite of the empty shelves in the East Wing study and the too quiet corridor and the quality of a place designed for someone expected to stay in it and not disturb anything. He was disturbing her careful isolation by sitting quietly in libraries. It was a very effective approach. She was not sure whether it was intentional. She was not sure she needed to know yet. The morning sickness eased slightly in the 9th week, as Harwick had promised. Not gone, she was not so lucky as that, but changed, less violent, more of a persistent low-level difficulty that she could work around. She had discovered that eating something very small before she got out of bed helped, and Nell had begun leaving a small plate on the bedside table the night before without being asked, which meant either that Mrs. Calloway had instructed her or that she had worked it out for herself. And either way, Ilara was grateful in the particular way. She was grateful for things that arrived without requiring her to ask for them. She could eat more at meals, she spent more time out of her room. This meant she was in the main corridors more, and in the library more, and occasionally in the smaller sitting room off the main hall that had a southern exposure and caught the afternoon light, which was not warm in the same way southern light was warm in her father's city, but was at least present, and she had decided to count present as sufficient. She was in the sitting room on a Thursday afternoon when she heard footsteps that stopped outside the door, and then the sound of voices, Draven's, and another one she didn't know lower, with the careful deference of someone delivering information rather than conversing. She could not hear the words, she was not trying to. But she could hear the change in Draven's voice between his first response and his second, a shift in weight, a quality that was not louder but more compressed, which she had come to understand was his version of what other men might express by raising their voice. Then silence. Then his footsteps moving away. She stayed in the sitting room for another hour with her book open and unread, thinking about the compressed quality of his voice, and what it meant when a man like Draven Asheville had information delivered to him in a tone that made his responses go denser. She did not ask about it. Not that day. She asked about it 3 days later, when she found him standing at the window of the main study at a time when he was usually at his desk. She had come to return a book she had borrowed from the shelf in the study, his copy of a legal history of the Northern Territories that she had taken to help her understand the duchy she was technically a part of, and she knocked, and came in, and put the book on the desk, and then said, because she had decided she was not going to manage information in this household. Something changed 3 days ago. He turned from the window. She looked at him. Your correspondence changed. The clerk in the corridor has had more traffic. You have been in the study after midnight 3 nights running. And I know this because the light is visible under the door at the end of the east wing corridor when I wake at 2. He looked at her with that quality of attention that she had come to understand was not blankness, but was in fact very focused engagement, the kind that came from a man who gave things his full concentration, and had learned to keep that concentration behind a surface that didn't reveal it. You observe a great deal, he said. I am a physician's daughter, she said. I was trained to notice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came away from the window and sat at his desk, which was his way of settling into a conversation that was going to be substantive rather than brief. She sat in the chair across from him without being asked. He said, there has been communication from a house in the south, one of the secondary noble houses. They are aware of the pregnancy. He paused, aware with a specificity that suggests they have a source inside the keep. She sat with this. Who, she said. I have a strong suspicion, he said. I do not yet have confirmation. I am being careful because I would rather have certainty before I act than act on suspicion and warn them before I can remove them. She recognized this approach. It was how she thought. She said nothing about that. What do they want? She said. They have not said directly, he said. They have sent communications of a social nature, inquiries about the health of the household. Congratulations on the marriage, delayed by 6 weeks to be precisely calibrated as a reminder that they were not at the ceremony. He looked at the papers on his desk. In the language of this particular kind of correspondence, these are introductory signals. They are establishing that they know. The request will come later. She understood then. They were not acting yet. They were telling him that they were going to act. They were telling him that the pregnancy was known and that they had a card to play when the time suited them. The source inside the keep, she said. Could they have known since the blood moon? He looked at her, adjusted again. You connect information quickly, he said. I had a reason to understand the blood moon's significance, she said. If the house already had a source here, and if the blood moon's effects are documented imperfectly, but documented, someone might have connected the timing. He was very still. The source, she said, would need to have access to information about the household's activities, and to have known enough to identify that the blood moon night had significance. Yes, he said. Which means someone who has been here long enough to have access to routines, or someone with access to the library. She paused. Or someone who received information from outside and relayed it. He looked at his papers. There was something very controlled about the way he was looking at them. I will find them, he said, and the compression was back in his voice, the denseness, and she understood now what that meant. I know you will, she said. She stood to go. He said, Elara, for the second time. Each time he used her name, she noted it, because he used it rarely and always at the moments when something he was not going to say was being communicated by the name itself. She turned. Stay in the main corridors, he said, not the east wing passages at night, not the north tower which was already closed, until I have resolved this. She looked at him. She thought about arguing because she was not in the habit of having her movements managed. She thought about the 3 heartbeats that were currently her most important responsibility. She thought about what it would mean to be stubborn about this, in a way that was principled but impractical. All right, she said. He nodded. She went back to the sitting room. She sat in the afternoon light, such as it was, and she thought about sources inside households and information delivered to outside houses, and the very specific timing of congratulations that arrived 6 weeks late. She thought about her father's debt, and the physician who had declared her barren and the house that had orchestrated both, and she thought about how it felt to be the point at which multiple threads converged. She was not afraid. She was paying very close attention. That evening at dinner, they were both in the main hall, and Draven sat at the table with his usual correspondence, and she sat with her book, and they ate and read and did not speak except when she passed him the bread and he said thank you, which was 2 words but more than usual. After dinner, she went upstairs instead of back to the east wing, because he had asked her to use the main corridors, and because she had agreed. In the corridor outside her room she found a guard she had not seen before, a tall, quiet man she did not recognize, positioned at the end of the passage. He nodded when she passed. She looked at him for a moment, noting his placement, noting that he was not at the door but at the corridor's end, not confining but covering the approach. She understood the distinction. She went inside. Nell had built the fire up higher than usual. On the bedside table the small plate was there as always, with plain bread and a cup of warm water with lemon, which Harwick had suggested, and which she had mentioned to no one except Harwick, which meant Draven had spoken to Harwick and Harwick had spoken to Nell. She sat on the bed. She thought about what it meant when a man who had not looked at her face on the day they signed a contract was now managing corridor guards and warm lemon water, and the precise positioning of household staff, while simultaneously hunting a leak in his own household with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before and intended to do it thoroughly. She was beginning, carefully, to revise something. She pressed her hand to herself. All 3 heartbeats steady and present. She lay down and looked at the ceiling, and outside the guard's footsteps were a steady measured sound in the corridor, and the fire was warm, and the mountains were enormous and dark and quiet, and she thought, we are not strangers anymore. Not entirely. Not anymore. The guard's name, she learned the next morning, was Owen. He had been with the Asheville household for 11 years. He had the particular quality of experienced household guards, alert in a way that didn't require visible alertness, present without being obtrusive, and possessed of the professional ability to be simultaneously a person and a piece of furniture depending on what the moment required. She brought him tea at 7 in the morning because she had walked past him 3 times and he had had nothing, and she was a physician's daughter, which meant she had a reflexive awareness of people who were working without resources. He looked startled, then composed, then genuinely grateful in a way he didn't quite manage to hide before the composure reasserted itself. "Thank you, my lady," he said. She nodded and went to the library. She was beginning to think about the corridors of the keep differently. In the first weeks, she had been learning the building, the layout, the distances, the acoustic properties of different passages, the way sound moved or didn't move through the stone. Now she was learning it again with the knowledge of what it was protecting, and that was a different kind of learning. The East Wing corridors were quiet and isolated. That had felt at first like appropriate distance between herself and a household she wasn't part of. Now it felt different. Now she saw the East Wing's isolation as a geography that made her accessible to someone who wanted to approach without being seen. She thought about this for several days without saying anything. Then she said something. "I would like," she said to Mrs. Calloway, catching her in the kitchen corridor on a quiet afternoon, "to move my primary sitting room to the one off the main hall, the one with the southern exposure." Mrs. Calloway looked at her. "Of course, my lady, should I speak to the Duke?" "I have already spoken to him," Alara said, which was not technically accurate. She had told him she would use the main corridors, which amounted to the same decision. "I simply wanted to inform you of the change in practice." "I'll have it arranged this afternoon," Mrs. Calloway said, and that was that. She moved her books and her work into the southern sitting room and began spending her afternoons there, in the afternoon light, closer to the main flow of household activity, closer to the corridors that were occupied and monitored, further from the isolated East Wing passages that she had begun to think of as a liability rather than a sanctuary. She did not think of it as retreating, she thought of it as a tactical adjustment. Draven said nothing about it directly, but he began using the southern sitting room in the evenings, after dinner, with his correspondents, and so they began sharing the same room with greater frequency, which was a different arrangement than they had established before and which she thought was, on balance, the correct one. They talked, not about easy things, neither of them were people who talked about easy things, but about real ones, about the duchy and its politics which she had been studying and which he confirmed and extended, about her father's practice and the cases she remembered, which he listened to with focused attention that was, she thought, partly professional. He was always calculating relevance, and partly something that wasn't professional at all. About the books they were both reading and what they thought about them, which was where they disagreed most productively, because they had different relationships to certainty, and this made their disagreements interesting rather than frustrating. She began to look forward to the evenings, in a way that she applied a great deal of caution to, because looking forward to things was something she had learned to manage carefully. On the 14th day after Owen had appeared in the corridor, she was in the sitting room at mid-morning, writing a letter to Clara that was honest about the pregnancy and carefully non-specific about everything else, when she heard the sound she had come to associate with Draven's version of urgency, not the compression in his voice, which was what she heard at distance, but a quality in his footsteps, a very slight change in cadence that she had only noticed 3 times before. She set down the pen. He came to the sitting room doorway. He didn't knock, which was unusual. She looked at him. "The source has been identified," he said. She waited. "One of the kitchen staff," he said. "A boy hired 8 months ago, recommended by a house in the southern quarter." He paused. "Not the house sending correspondence, a connected house, 1 link removed." She thought about this carefully. "1 link removed," she said. "So the primary house has distance." "Yes," he said. "They can deny knowledge of the boy. He was placed through an intermediary." "What will happen to him?" she said. Draven looked at her. The question was not what he had expected. "He is being questioned," he said. "He will be removed from the household." "He is a boy," she said. "How old?" Draven paused. 17. She absorbed this. A 17-year-old who had been placed in a household at the instruction of people far above his pay and understanding, likely told enough to do what was needed, and not enough to understand what he was actually participating in. "He should not face consequences beyond removal," she said. "He was used." Draven was quiet for a moment. "He passed information that put you at risk," he said, and the compression was there under the words. "He passed information that powerful people told him to pass," she said. "He is 17. The people who placed him are not 17, they are the ones who chose to do this." Draven looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said, which was 2 words that she recognized as containing a great deal more than they appeared to on the surface. It was a concession that was also a revelation, a small window into the fact that when she said things that were reasonable, he was capable of adjusting in response. She had suspected this. It was useful to have it confirmed. "The primary house," she said, "the one sending correspondence." "I know who they are now," he said. "What will you do?" He looked at the window. "Nothing yet," he said. "I want them to believe they are still in a position of advantage. When people believe that, they move." She thought about this, and when they move, she said. "Then I will be ready," he said. He looked at her. "I am telling you this because you asked me to speak to you," he said. "About real things. I am speaking to you about a real thing." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. He left the doorway. She sat in the sitting room and picked up her pen and looked at the half-finished letter to Clara and thought about 17-year-old boys in primary houses and one link of removal, and about the particular specific architecture of how powerful people manage to cause harm while keeping their own hands clean. She thought about her father's debt, the physician, the years of being told she was barren, of building a life around a closed door. All of it arranged, all of it someone's design. She set the pen down. She pressed her hands together. She thought about Draven's voice when he said "nothing yet," and the quality of patience in it, not the patience of someone waiting because they have no other option, but the patience of someone who has done this before and knows that the moment of real action is worth waiting for. She thought, "He is very good at this." She thought, "So it turns out, am I?" She picked up the pen and finished the letter to Clara. She told her sister that the mountains were very large and the tea was surprisingly good, and that she was, improbably but genuinely, all right. She did not tell her about the source in the kitchen, or the house sending timed correspondence, or the 3 heartbeats that were currently the most important thing in the keep. She would tell her about those later, when there was more to tell. The candles arrived on a Wednesday. She would not know this until after, which was the nature of things that are designed to pass unnoticed. The candles were delivered with the weekly household supplies, packed into the standard wooden crates with the standard invoices, indistinguishable from the dozens of other candles that moved through a large keep supply chain in any given week. They were placed in the storeroom. From the storeroom, 3 were selected by the junior housekeeper who managed the East Wing's daily arrangements, because Alara had mentioned twice that she preferred the smaller candles in her reading room over the larger standing ones. The junior housekeeper, a woman named Agnes who was competent and thorough and entirely ignorant of what she was doing, had made a note of this preference and acted on it. The candles were placed in the East Wing reading room on Wednesday afternoon. Alara lit them at 7 in the evening after dinner. By 9 she had a headache. She was not a person who had frequent headaches, so she noted it with the same attention she gave any symptom, a data point filed, kept under observation. She set down her book. The headache was concentrated behind her eyes, which was different from the tension headaches she sometimes got from reading in poor light, and the candles were giving good light, so that was not the cause. She pressed 2 fingers between her brows. By 10, the headache had become something more insistent, and she had a quality of difficulty breathing that she had not had before coming into the room, a faint tightness that was not panic, which she knew the texture of, but something external. She looked at the candles. They were burning very cleanly, no unusual smoke, no visible reason for concern. She trusted the symptom over the visual evidence because she had been trained too. She went to the window and pushed it open, and the cold night air came in with a directness that was almost physical, and within 3 breaths the tightness eased. She stood at the window for a long time, breathing cold air. The candles burned behind her. She turned around. She looked at them for a long moment. 3 small candles burning very cleanly. She thought about the headache. She thought about the tightness. She thought about the fact that both had arrived at the same time and both had eased when she opened the window, and neither had any other obvious cause. She was a physician's daughter. She went to the reading room door, opened it, and called for Owen. He appeared with the efficient promptness that she had come to expect from him, and she pointed at the candles and said, "Remove these and bag them separately from any other household items. Do not dispose of them. I need them examined." Owen looked at the candles. He looked at her. "Now," she said very quietly. He moved without asking questions, which was one of the things she was most grateful for about Owen. She went to the corridor and stood in the cold air of the passage and breathed, and by the time Draven appeared 3 minutes later, which told her that Owen had not gone to remove the candles and then reported. He had reported first, because he understood what mattered. The tightness in her chest was almost entirely gone. Draven came down the East Wing corridor at a pace that was not running but was not walking either, and the expression on his face was not one she had seen before, and she took it in and filed it and said immediately before he could speak, "I am well. The children are well. I am standing here. Please observe that I am standing here." He stopped. He looked at her. The expression was still there, that same compression she heard in his voice sometimes, but visible now in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, in the particular quality of his hands at his sides. "Oh, and," he said. "Candles," she said, "3 of them in the reading room. I noticed the symptoms before any real harm was done." She kept her voice even because she did not want to panic in a corridor with 3 children that she needed to remain calm for. "I have medical training. I recognized it." He looked at the door of the reading room past her. Owen came out of it with the candles in a bag held well away from himself. Draven said something to Owen that she didn't catch, very quietly, and Owen left the corridor in the direction of the main household. Then Draven looked at her. She looked back. "The East Wing," she said. "You are not staying in the East Wing tonight," he said, and it was the least negotiable sentence he had ever said to her, and she did not negotiate it, because she had also arrived at this conclusion independently. "The South Corridor room," she said. "It is close to the main hall." "My floor," he said. "There are 2 rooms in the West Corridor with a shared passage. You will have full privacy. You will also be." "On your floor," she said. "Yes," he said. She thought about the East Wing with its 2 sets of heavy doors, and its long, isolated passage, and the junior housekeeper who had placed candles in her reading room with complete ignorance, and therefore no ability to protect against the next person who handed her something she didn't know was wrong. "All right," she said. "Now," he said. She went back into the East Wing room and packed the things she needed: medical books, notebooks, the carved wooden box from the bottom of the bag, her 2 warm coats. Everything else could be moved tomorrow by someone who knew what they were handling. She was back in the corridor in 8 minutes. Draven had waited. She had not expected him to wait. He walked with her to the West Corridor, and she noticed that he walked slightly behind her and to her left, which put him between her and any approach from the east-facing passage, and she noted this positioning with the same attention she gave all things and did not say anything about it. The room on his floor was not the East Wing. It was warmer, closer, with a view to the courtyard rather than the mountains, and it had a door that connected via a short internal passage to a second room which she assumed was his, though the passage was closed. "The passage locks from both sides," he said when he saw her note it. "I understand," she said. She was not concerned about the passage. She had already evaluated him as a risk and decided he was not one. She said this directly. "I am not concerned about the passage." He looked at her. "I am concerned about the people who put candles in my reading room," she said. "You can lock whatever doors you find appropriate." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Are you in pain?" "Headache," she said, "fading. Harwick will examine me tomorrow." He nodded. He moved toward the door that led back to the main passage, and she thought he was going to leave, but he stopped with his hand on the frame. "I should have moved you sooner," he said. She looked at him. His back was partially to her, which meant he was saying this to the door rather than to her directly, and she thought that was probably as much as she was going to get tonight. "You did not know there was a maid," she said. "I should have assumed it," he said. "They knew about the pregnancy. They had a source inside the household. I should have assumed they would act on the information before I was finished gathering my own." She sat on the edge of the bed. The headache was still there, diminished to something manageable. "You found the source," she said. "That was the right move first." He turned from the door. He looked at her across the room. "You are remarkably composed," he said, "for someone who was just given poisoned candles." "I am a physician's daughter," she said. "I believe I have mentioned this several times." The corner of his mouth. This time she did not have to work to see it. "Sleep," he said. "I will be in the next room." She looked at him. "I know," she said. He left. She sat in the new room and let the headache wind down and listened to the quiet of a floor that had someone else on it. Someone whose barely audible footsteps she could hear moving in the passage on the other side of the door, which was not frightening, which was not isolating, which was something she was not going to name yet, but which she was willing tonight to simply be grateful for. She lay down. All 3 heartbeats steady and present. In the morning, when Harwick came, he confirmed what she had told him on the corridor. The exposure had been early stage, caught quickly, no lasting damage, thanks to her observation and her decision to act on the first unusual symptom rather than waiting for the second. "You were lucky," Harwick said. "I was trained," she said. He made a note. Outside the window, in the courtyard, she could see two of the household guard conducting a quiet, thorough inspection of the supply crates that had arrived the previous Wednesday. They were methodical and unhurried, which meant they had been told what they were looking for. She watched them through the glass. She thought about the house that had sent the congratulations 6 weeks late, the house that had placed a 17-year-old boy in the kitchen and then placed candles in a supply chain, the house that was moving with the particular calculated patience of people who believed they still had time. She pressed her hand flat against herself. All three warm and present. She thought about Draven's voice the previous night in the corridor, the compression in it, the way it sounded the same as the version she had heard through closed doors in the South Quarter correspondence discussion, but with a different quality underneath, one she was only now learning to distinguish. The previous version had been controlled anger, the anger of a problem to be solved. Last night's version had been something else. She was not going to name that either. Not yet. But she was filing it, alongside all the other things she was filing, the warm room on his floor, the way he had positioned himself in the corridor, the footsteps on the other side of the passage door. She had a great many things in that file now. She thought it might be getting heavier than she had planned for. She turned from the window. She went to work. The investigation that followed the candles was swift, and from what she could observe from the edges of it, extremely thorough. She was not invited into the center of it. She did not require an invitation. She was gathering her own information from the parts of it that were visible to her, which was, she found, quite a lot. She had learned that a large household's investigation looked chaotic from the outside, but was actually highly organized from the inside, and the evidence of its organization was visible in the smaller things, the pattern of which doors opened and closed, the deployment of specific staff to specific tasks, the quality of silence in certain corridors versus others. Draven ran it the way she imagined he ran everything, methodically, without haste, without showing his hand until he was ready to play it. She did not see him for most of the day following the candles. He was in meetings she did not attend, with people she did not yet know. This was not because he was excluding her. It was because this was his household and his investigation and his century-long network of people who knew how to do this, and she had not yet been here long enough to be part of it. She understood this distinction without resentment. What she did instead was read. She went back to the library and found the section on the Southern noble houses, thinner than the political history sections but present, and read it with the focused attention that she had applied to everything in the keep since her arrival. She built a map in her head of who was connected to whom, which families had intersected with the Asheville line's history and in what context, which disputes had been settled and which ones had not. She identified 4 families that fit the profile of what Draven had described: resources to manage a supply chain insertion, connections to the medical community that would have given access to a physician willing to provide a false diagnosis, and a specific reason to want leverage over an Asheville air situation. She wrote them down. She crossed 2 off based on what she knew about the Blood Moon's documentation and who would have had access to it. She was left with 2. She put the paper in her pocket and went to find Draven. He was in the main study. The door was not entirely closed, and she knocked on the frame and came in when he looked up. She put the paper on the desk in front of him. He looked at it, he looked at her, he looked at the paper again. "The one on the left," he said. "I thought so," she said. He sat back. Something in his expression had the quality of a person who keeps being surprised in the same direction and is not yet sure how to account for it. "Where did you find the Marchmont connection?" he said. "Third shelf, south wall of the library," she said. "The Asheville trade records from 2 generations back. The Marchmont family contested a river route agreement and lost. They have been positioned as cooperative since then, very deliberately positioned." She sat down. "Cooperative enemies are more concerning than obvious ones." He looked at her. "I know," he said, and the quality of those 2 words was different from how he usually used them. Not agreement, something more specific. She recognized it because she had heard it only once before from her father, when she had found something in a patient file that had changed his diagnosis. He had said, "I know," in exactly that way, the version that means not "I agree, but I see you clearly." She did not say anything about this. "What will you do?" she said instead. "I will deal with Marchmont," he said. "The letter first, or direct action?" He looked at her steadily. "Why do you distinguish?" "Because the letter leaves a record and makes them defensive," she said. "Direct action removes the advantage but may not address the broader network. Both have costs. I am curious which cost you have decided to absorb." He was quiet for a long moment. "The letter," he said, "first." "Then direct action," she said. "Then direct action," he confirmed. She nodded. She stood to go. "Elara," he said, third time. She turned. "I will end this," he said, and it was simple and flat and entirely credible, and she believed it completely. "I know," she said, in the way that meant she saw him clearly. She went back to the sitting room with the southern exposure. She sat in the afternoon light and pressed both hands to her middle and thought about candles and Marchmont, and a house that had tried to remove her quietly before she could become the thing they couldn't afford, a mother of Asheville heirs, planted firmly in the keep, with 3 months more of pregnancy to go and a husband who was, she was now very certain, not going to let anything else happen to her without going through him first. She thought about the file she was keeping, the one full of things she was not yet naming. She opened a new page in her notebook. She wrote down everything she had found about Marchmont. Not for the investigation, Draven had what he needed. She wrote it for herself, because she had been a physician's daughter in a household where knowledge was the most practical thing you could carry, and she was not going to be caught without it. She thought about Clara, 16 and stubborn and still in the city to the south, and about her father, who had done a terrible thing and a necessary thing, and was going to have to live inside the distinction between them for the rest of his life. She thought about arriving at this keep 6 weeks ago in a carriage, having rehearsed nothing, having only the practical luggage of a woman who didn't expect good things. She thought about where she was now. Still uncertain, still mid-process, still very much inside something that hadn't shown her its shape yet. But not alone in it, that was the difference, that was what had shifted without her naming it. She was not in it alone. She did not expect him to come to her room at 9 in the evening. She had been reading, as she usually was at 9, in the chair by the window of the west corridor room that had now been hers for 3 weeks. The fire built up because the mountain cold in the deeper part of winter had become serious, and no amount of stone wall insulation was entirely equal to it at elevation. She had a blanket. She had her book. She had the tea that Nell had left on the small table beside her, and she had the sound of the keep in its evening mode, quieter, but never fully silent, always the low ambient presence of a building this large and this inhabited. The knock came at her door, which was the shared passage door, the one that connected to his side. She said, "Come in." He came in. He was not in his formal coat. He was in a simpler version of himself, the dark coat he wore in the evenings, and a quality of having been working for several hours, which she recognized from the particular way he carried his shoulders when he had been at correspondence for a long stretch. He stood in the doorway. He did not sit down, but he was not blocking the exit in the way people stand when they are about to deliver difficult news. He was simply present in her space, which he had been careful about until now. She looked at him. "Sit down," she said. He came and sat in the other chair, the one that had appeared in the room she had noticed, about 4 days after she moved in, which she had not asked for but which she had understood immediately. He sat. She closed her book. They looked at each other, and she waited, because he had come to her room, which meant he had something to say, and she was going to let him find the way to say it. He said, "The Marchmont letter was received this afternoon." She had not expected that to be the opening. She had expected the investigation update, yes, but the tone was different from his investigation tone. The investigation tone was managed, organized. This was something else. And she said, "They responded within 2 hours, he said, which is not normal diplomatic timing." "No," she said, 2 hours is too fast. They were ready." "They were ready," he confirmed. The response contained an inventory of what they know. In the language of their house, this is an offer. Here is the information we have. We are letting you see it. We could use it. She sat with this. They are still positioned as cooperative, she said. They are showing you the weapon but not firing it. They want you to ask what it would take to make them put it down. Yes, he said. Which means they think they still have leverage, she said. They believe they are ahead, he said. They do not know the candles were identified and removed. They believe the slow poisoning is still in progress. He said this very carefully, with a control that was not his investigation control. Something was underneath it. She thought about what it meant that he was here, at 9 in the evening, telling her this. He was not here to update her on the investigation. He had come here because he needed to say something that was not an update. She waited. He looked at the fire. He had a way of looking at the fire when he was working out how to say a thing. She had catalogued this. I do not often, he said, and stopped. He tried again. There are things in which I do not require assistance. I have managed this duchy for 3 centuries. I have dealt with houses like Marchmont before. I have dealt with considerably more sophisticated threats than Marchmont. He paused. I am telling you that I understand this is not a situation that requires your fear. It will be resolved. She looked at him. I know, she said. I am also telling you, he said, and now the careful control was doing something different, that there is something I find. He stopped. She waited. He looked at her directly. You were in this building for 8 weeks before I understood that you were not simply an arrangement that had been made, he said. I am accustomed to being thorough. I was not thorough about this. She set her book down on the table. She looked at him. You are telling me, she said slowly, that you are not paying attention and you are bothered by this. I am telling you, he said, that someone tried to harm you in my household and I had not made the connections I should have made earlier. I had not considered the specific risk until it had already materialized. She was very still. Draven, she said. His name, she did not use it often. His expression when she used it was worth being careful about because it did something to his face that she did not want to misread. I am not a person who makes errors of calculation this significant, he said, and I am sitting here because I am trying to explain to you that the error was not because I did not care. The opposite. She breathed. She thought about what it took for a man who had managed a duchy for 300 years, who did not use excess words for anything, who had spent 3 centuries being the kind of person who did not explain himself, to come to her room and use words like the opposite. You were not, she said carefully, careless. You were managing multiple situations simultaneously, and you assigned priority based on the information you had. The information about Marchmont's methods was not available to you until they acted. That is a generous reading, he said. It is an accurate reading, she said. I am not generous, I am precise. He looked at her. Something in his face had eased slightly, just enough to be visible. Ask me something, he said. Which was what she had said to him weeks ago in the library, the words he was returning to her. She considered. She said, what did you think when you first heard about the pregnancy? He was quiet for a long moment. I thought that something I had not expected was happening, he said, and that my expectations had been wrong in a way that I had not accounted for, and that this was not an inconvenience. I could not locate it as an inconvenience, which surprised me. She looked at him. Not an inconvenience, she said. What was it? He looked at the fire again. Something important, he said finally. She absorbed this. She thought about all the things that were in the file she kept, the one that was getting heavy. She thought about warm rooms and 2 chairs in a library, and the way he positioned himself in corridors, and 3 weeks of footsteps through a shared passage door, and the way he had said her name 3 times, each time meaning something slightly different. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. When my father told me about the arrangement, she said, I did not cry. I did not ask for more time. I got into the carriage and came here because I had already decided that if this was going to happen, I was going to meet it straight on. She paused. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that I did not expect anything good from this arrangement. I had genuinely planned for nothing good. He was watching her. And I want you to know, she said, that I have been consistently surprised since the first week, and I am someone who is not often surprised. The fire burned. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said, very quietly, I have not been surprised in a very long time. She understood 300 years of not being surprised. Are you now? She said. He looked at her. Frequently, he said. She thought about all the ways she could respond to this. She chose the honest one. Good, she said. I think it is good for you. The corner of his mouth, the fullest version of it she had seen. She did not look away from it. You should sleep, he said, eventually, and she could see he was saying it because he did not trust himself to stay in the room much longer without the conversation going somewhere neither of them had planned for tonight. She understood she was the same. I will, she said, Draven. He stopped at the passage door. Thank you, she said, for coming to tell me. He stood in the doorway for a moment. I will deal with Marchmont, he said. You will not need to think about them again. I know, she said. He closed the door. She sat in the chair for a long time after, with the fire and her book and the tea that had gone cold, and the weight of the file in her chest that she was going to have to open soon, because she was not a woman who carried things indefinitely without naming them. She thought not tonight. Tonight is not the night for that. She thought soon, though. She turned out the lamp. She lay in the warm bed in the west corridor room and listened to the mountains doing what mountains do, which was nothing at all, and the keep doing what the keep did, which was warm and solid and permanent around her, and she thought about the word frequently, and what it meant from a man who had spent 3 centuries without being surprised by anything. She pressed her hand to herself. 3 heartbeats. Her own steady and quiet. Sleep came before she was ready for it, and this time the dreams, when they arrived, were not empty. The next morning she told him about her father. She had not told him the full story. He knew about the barrenness diagnosis, knew about the physician and the house that had arranged it. He knew the structure of it. He did not know what it had done to her, which was a different kind of knowledge. She told him over breakfast, without planning to. She was talking about something else, about a patient she remembered from her father's practice, a case she had thought of that morning when reading about a blood condition in one of the medical texts she had sourced from the library, and she said mid-sentence, "My father would have disagreed with that treatment. He was very conservative about interventions involving the blood specifically, which is perhaps why the diagnosis." And then she stopped because she had not meant to go there. Draven was looking at her. The diagnosis, he said very gently, which was not a word she often applied to him but was the accurate one for the tone. She set down her cup. She said, I was 22. I had a patient I was attached to, one of my father's older patients, a woman named Mrs. Allerton who had been coming to his practice since before I was born and who treated me like a person rather than a physician's assistant, which not all of them did. She had told me the year before that I should have children, that she could see it in me, that kind of specific way that older women sometimes claim to see things. She paused, and then the physician told me I couldn't. And Mrs. Allerton was the 3rd person I thought of, after my father and Clara. I thought about having to tell her. Draven was still. I didn't tell anyone, actually, she said. I told my father and he already knew, of course, because it was his colleague. And I didn't tell Clara because she was 13 and it wasn't something to put on a 13-year-old. And I didn't tell Mrs. Allerton because I didn't know how. She looked at the window. And then she died the following winter, and I was glad after that I hadn't told her. Not because I would have been wrong to, but because she would have been angry on my behalf, and that would have made it harder to carry. He said nothing. She said, I built a very complete picture of my life without children. It had been 3 years, I was not still raw about it, I had integrated it. And then I came here and the blood moon, and she stopped. She made herself finish. I want you to know that I am not taking this for granted, what has happened, the reversal of it. I am not treating it as my due or as something that was always going to happen. I know what it is. I know what it cost to not have it for 3 years, and I know what it is to have it now. Draven looked at her for a long moment. He said, Mrs. Allerton would have been angry on your behalf. She looked at him. Yes, she said, she would. She was right, he said, to be angry. Something in her chest shifted, a small movement but present. Yes, she said, she was. They sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I would like to hear about the patient you were treating, the one this morning. She looked at him. He was already looking at the medical text that was still open beside her plate, with an expression that was that small revised calculation, the version she had learned to read as interest rather than assessment. She pulled the book toward them both. She explained the case. He listened with his whole attention, the way he listened to everything completely and without interruption. When she finished, he said, "The blood was the variable, not the treatment. The standard intervention would have masked the underlying cause." He paused. "Your father was correct." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I have had 3 centuries in which to develop a working knowledge of blood conditions," he said, and the dryness of it was so unexpected that she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in this keep, fully, not the small controlled thing she sometimes did in response to something he said, but actually laughed. And it surprised her as much as it surprised him, and she saw the surprise on his face, and then something else, something she had seen only in pieces before but which was now more fully present, a quality of warmth, carefully held behind the composed surface. She recovered. "You could have mentioned that," she said, "meaning the 3 centuries of blood condition knowledge." "You did not ask," he said, and the dryness was still there, and she laughed again, shorter this time, and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. He watched her. She thought, "This is the conversation I was not expecting to have. This is the morning I did not plan for. This is the specific texture of being surprised by a person who has been holding more than he shows, and discovering it in the ordinary space of breakfast." "Ask me something," she said. He thought. He said, "What would you have done if not this, if the arrangement had not been made?" She considered this genuinely. "I would have continued in my father's practice," she said. "I was good at it. I would have been good for many years. I would have." She paused. "I had made peace with a very specific kind of life, useful and quiet, and mine. I was not unhappy with it." She looked at him. "But it was smaller than this." He sat with that. "And this," he said, meaning now here, the thing she was currently inside. She looked around the main hall, at the high stone walls and the fire and the gray mountain light coming through the windows, and the untouched cup of tea on his side of the table, and the medical book between them. "Larger," she said, "than I planned for." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She thought about Mrs. Allerton, who had died the winter she was 23, and who would have been very angry on her behalf, and who would also, she was certain of this, have had a great deal to say about the man sitting across the table from her now. She thought she would have liked to hear it. She picked up the medical book. He stayed for another hour. They talked about blood conditions and his father's interest in them, and the particular quality of the Asheville line's history with its own nature, which was not what the stories said, and not what the old books said, and was in fact much quieter and more domestic than either, more a practical aspect of existence than a defining horror, lived with over centuries the way you live with any fundamental thing that is simply true about you. She listened to this with her full attention and did not flinch from any of it. He noticed that she did not flinch. She noticed that he noticed. By the time Nell came to clear the breakfast things, the morning had become midday, and neither of them had moved from the table, and the medical book was open between them to a completely different page than it had started, and the tea on his side of the table was still untouched, but she had stopped noticing it. The birth happened at 4 in the morning, in the middle of a storm. The mountains had been building it for 2 days, the way mountain storms build, slowly at first, with a change in air pressure that she could feel in her joints, which was new to her, and which Harwick had said was common in the final weeks, the body becoming extraordinarily sensitive as it prepared for the enormous physical event ahead. The wind had come from the north the first day, strong and direct. By the second day it was lateral and wet, carrying snow in dense horizontal sheets that struck the windows with a sound like handfuls of rice. She had been awake since 2, not from pain. The labor had started after midnight, gradually and then with increasing authority, but from the ordinary alertness that comes when your body is doing something it has never done before and has a quality of focus that overrides everything else. She had woken Mrs. Calloway, who had woken Harwick, who had arrived at her room within 15 minutes, which she appreciated. He was very calm. She was very calm. They were 2 medical people dealing with a physiological event, which was the framing she had chosen and which she was holding onto with both hands. This framing lasted approximately 30 minutes. Then it became substantially harder than any framing she had prepared for. She did not cry. She made sounds that she would not describe as crying, sounds that were a straightforward physical response to a straightforward physical process, sounds that she would never again hear without understanding exactly what they were. She kept her breathing as Harwick directed, and she held the bedpost, and she focused on the space directly in front of her, one breath after another. Draven was not in the room. She had not asked him to be. Harwick's 2 assistants were there, and Mrs. Calloway and Nell, who had somehow materialized without being called, and who was stationed near the door doing exactly what was needed at all moments without being asked, which elevated her considerably in Alara's opinion. Draven was outside. She knew this because she could hear his footsteps. He was not pacing, which she might have expected. He was not still either. He was doing something in between, a slow, continuous movement back and forth in the passage outside her door, with that barely audible quality of his footsteps, and she heard them in the spaces between the more immediate sounds, and there was a particular quality to them that she was going to remember for a very long time. She had not asked him to stay outside. He had simply stayed outside, and she understood, without it needing to be discussed, that this was because he had asked what she wanted, and she had said she needed Harwick and Mrs. Calloway and concentration, and he had taken this as the complete answer. She had not had to negotiate it. She had not had to manage it. The first child arrived at 4 in the morning. Harwick placed her in Alara's arms, and for a moment the room went very quiet, the storm pressing against the windows, and she looked at the small face, her face, she thought, though this face was its own thing entirely, and not like anything she had a comparison for, and something broke open in her chest that had no other word for it. She heard something from the passage. The footsteps had stopped. She thought, he can hear her. He can hear everything in this room from the passage, because that is simply what he is, and he has been listening to this for hours, and the footsteps have stopped because the first heartbeat that is not mine has arrived, and he has felt that. She pressed her lips to the small head. The next 2 were harder and faster and more complicated, and Harwick was very focused and very competent, and at some point Mrs. Calloway went to the door and said something in a low voice to the passage, and the door opened briefly and then closed again. She did not know what was said. She was otherwise occupied. The last of the 3 arrived at 6 in the morning, when the storm was beginning to ease, and the sky outside was doing that specific thing it does at high elevation in the early morning after heavy snow, a blue-gray quality, very clean light that had never touched anything before. She lay back. All 3 were in the room. All 3 were breathing. Harwick said, "Well done," with the economy of a man who says it rarely, which meant it was entirely genuine, and she absorbed it and then said, "Let Draven in." Mrs. Calloway opened the door. He came in. She watched him cross the room, slowly, not his usual pace, with a quality she could not immediately identify and then could, because she had learned his catalogue well enough by now. It was the pace of someone who was being very careful not to let the size of what they were feeling overtake their physical control. He reached the side of the bed. He looked at the 3 of them, his children, arranged in their wrappings, all 3 awake with the fresh alertness of the newly arrived, looking at the room with dark eyes that were still finding their focus, and he was entirely still for a long moment. She watched him. His face did the thing she had seen begin, in pieces, over the months she had been in the keep, but never fully. The surface that he kept maintained, the managed composure that was not coldness but was the learned behavior of someone who had stopped expecting things, shifted, not broke, not collapsed, but shifted, the way stone shifts when the earth moves slowly underneath it. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked at each child separately, with a thoroughness that was recognizably his, the full attention, the counting quality. One, then the next, then the last. He said nothing. She said nothing. The fire crackled. The storm was ending outside, the last of the wind pulling past the stone walls with a sound that was already less than it had been an hour ago. Harwick and his assistants had withdrawn to the side of the room, with the professional tact of people who know when a moment does not belong to them. Draven looked at Alara. There was something in his face that she had no prior point of reference for from him or from anyone, not the calculation revised, not the careful warmth she had learned to see behind the surface, something that was present without any management, without any layer between it and the air in the room. She held it, she let him look at her. She thought 300 years, and here you are, sitting on the edge of a bed with the storm ending outside, and your face doing something that you are not going to be able to put back behind the surface it came from. She thought, good. He said, they are. He stopped. She waited. He looked back at the 3 of them. All of them, he said, which did not parse as a complete sentence but which she understood perfectly. All of them, she confirmed. He put out his hand slowly, carefully, and touched the cheek of the one nearest him with the back of his first finger, the smallest possible contact, testing something. The child turned toward the touch. Something happened in Draven's face. She looked away because this moment was his to have, and she was not going to observe it too directly, and also because her own eyes were doing something she was managing with considerable effort. She looked at the fire. She heard Mrs. Calloway, somewhere behind her, make a small sound and suppress it. She kept looking at the fire. After a while she felt his hand, his other hand, careful and present, rest over hers where it lay on the blanket. She turned her hand over. He did not let go. They sat like that in the clean morning light after the storm, while all three small new people went about the business of existing in the room, and the keep settled around them, and the mountains outside were quiet and white and enormous, and the fire burned, and neither of them said anything at all for a very long time. Eventually, Harwick came forward with his professional manner restored, and said that she needed to rest, and she conceded this without argument because she was exhausted in a way that went beyond any tiredness she had previously understood, the specific exhaustion of having done something enormous with her body that her body had never been told it was going to have to do. Draven stood. He was about to say something. She could see the construction of it in the set of his shoulders. She said, "Come back when I wake up." He looked at her. "I will be here," he said. She closed her eyes. She heard him walk to the door, stop, and then return one step too, and she heard him say something to Mrs. Calloway in a voice too low to catch, and she heard Mrs. Calloway say, "Of course," and then his footsteps going out. She slept. She slept deeply and without interruption for 3 hours, which was the most consecutive sleep she had had in the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy, and when she woke the room was bright with morning, and all 3 babies were in the arranged cradles that had been prepared for exactly this, and Draven was in the chair by the window. He had said he would be there. He was there. She looked at him. He looked at her. "They slept," he said. "All 3, she said. "All 3, he said. She let out a breath. She looked at the ceiling, and the clean morning light on it, and the 3 small cradles, and the man in the chair by the window who had spent the night in her room without being asked, and who was going to need, she thought, quite a lot of adjustment time over the coming weeks. So was she. So was everyone in this building. She thought, we have 3 months of conversation and 6 months of pregnancy and 1 blood moon and approximately 11 hours of labor between us, and we are somehow the parents of 3 children, and this is the most extraordinary sequence of events I have ever been inside. She thought I would not change it. She looked at the ceiling some more. She thought I would not change any of it. The names took 3 days. She had a system. She wrote them down in her notebook, the candidates, and she carried the notebook around the house and consulted it at intervals with the same methodical approach she applied to other important decisions. Harwick had told her that the naming traditionally took place within the week, which was the keep's custom. She thought this was a reasonable timeline. Draven did not suggest names. She noticed this and thought about it. She thought that he was perhaps waiting to be asked, because he was not a man who inserted himself into processes that had not invited him, even when those processes concerned him directly. She thought this was a flaw and also simultaneously a quality she had come to rely on. On the 3rd evening, she brought the notebook to the sitting room where he was working and put it on the table in front of him, open to the page with her list. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Tell me what you think," she said. He read the list carefully. She watched him read it with the attention he gave all things, the complete focus, the almost physical quality of engagement that his reading had. He pointed to one name. She looked at it. "Ada," she said. "For the eldest," he said, "it is precise, it suits her." She thought about the eldest, who had arrived first, and who had spent the subsequent 3 days demonstrating a quality of focused attention while awake that was startlingly recognizable. "Ada," she agreed. He pointed to the second name on the list. "Alias," she said. "He is patient," Draven said. "He waits." She thought about the boy, who was in fact the most settled of the three when awake, who looked at the room with a quality of measuring it before responding to it. Elias, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. The third, he said. She looked at the list. There were 2 names remaining that she had kept as candidates for the third. He said, neither of these. She looked at him. He said, there was a name in my family historically, not used in the current generation, a woman's name. He stopped. I would not suggest it if you had a preference. Tell me, she said. He said, Iris. She said the name quietly, trying it. She thought about the third, who was the smallest and who had the quality, even at 3 days old. She knew this was too early to assign qualities, but she was assigning them anyway, which was apparently what parenthood did to methodical people, of arriving in any situation at an angle slightly unexpected, who had not arrived first or second, who had arrived last on her own terms at 6 in the morning when the storm was already ending and the light was just changing. Iris, she said again. It was my grandmother's name, Draven said. She was, he paused, remarkable in the way the book used the word. She looked at him. She thought about a 300-year-old man using the word grandmother in the same sentence as the word remarkable, and what it said about the particular shape of history he carried. Iris, she said, yes. He looked at the notebook for another moment. She said, you should write it. Your grandmother's name, you should be the one to write it. He looked at her. She held out the pen. He took it. He wrote Iris under Ada and Elias in his own hand, which was a different quality of handwriting from hers, older somehow, more deliberate in its strokes, the handwriting of someone who had learned it when writing was a different, more considered act. She looked at the 3 names. She thought, there they are, 3 names, 3 people. 3 heartbeats that started as information and became, somewhere in the months between information and now, the most important fact in the room. She took the pen back. She closed the notebook. They sat in the sitting room with the fire burning and the sound of the children audible down the corridor, not crying, the small sounds of the awake and occupied, and she thought about the week she had arrived in the keep, the quality of her expectations, the specific kind of nothing she had prepared herself for. She thought, this is what it looks like when you are wrong about what is coming. She thought, I have never been happier to be wrong. Ada Elias and Iris Asheville, she said. He repeated it. It was the first time either of them had said all 3 names in sequence, and in the room, in the air between them, it was real. She stood. She thought she would go check on them. She always wanted to check on them. She had discovered that this was going to be a permanent condition, the wanting to go check, to confirm, to verify with her own senses that they were still there. She was at the door when he said, Ilara. 4th time. She turned. He was still at the table, the notebook in front of him, looking at her with the expression she had first fully seen the morning after the birth, in the chair by the window, the one without any layer over it. Thank you, he said, simply, without any other construction around it. She looked at him. She thought, for the children, or for the names, or for bringing the notebook to him, or for something larger than any of those, for the whole sequence of it, for being the person who arrived at this keep without expecting anything good and stayed and argued and investigated and read the library and sat in the firelit sitting room and did not leave. She thought probably all of it. Thank you, she said back. She went down the corridor. Ada was awake. She picked her up and Ada looked at her with that focused quality, and she held her and looked back, and it was very quiet and very warm, and the mountains outside were still and white in the dark, and the keep was all around them, solid and permanent in theirs. Elias was asleep, and Iris was doing something thoughtful with her fist, and she went to her one by one and settled them, and stood in the room for a long time in the good ordinary silence of a room where 3 new people were sleeping. Then she went back to the sitting room. He was still there. She sat down. She picked up her book. He picked up his correspondence. The fire burned, and the candle on the table between them burned, and outside the mountains were the mountains, and inside the keep was the keep, and the 2 of them sat in the warm sitting room with 3 sleeping children down the hall, and the silence between them was the specific comfortable silence of people who have been through something enormous together and come out the other side of it changed. She read her book. He read his correspondence. The night went on. She caught him at the nursery door on a morning in the second week, standing in the corridor outside it. Not going in, not walking past, simply standing in the way he stood at the edge of spaces, with the barely visible quality of someone who had been there for some time and had not yet decided whether to go further. She had come from the other end of the corridor with her coffee, and she stopped when she saw him, far enough away that she did not think he heard her approach. She watched him for a moment. He was looking at the door. The sounds from inside were the ordinary sounds of the early morning nursery, Nell's voice, low and practical, and the soft ambient presence of 3 children who had been awake since 5 and were currently managing it in their different ways. Ada loudly, Elias with patient intervals, Iris with the particular focused intensity that she had already learned to recognize as Iris's version of everything. Draven stood at the door and listened. She thought about going back around the corner and letting him not be observed. She thought about this for a moment, and then she walked toward him, because she had decided some weeks ago that she was not going to manage this situation by giving him corners to not be observed in. She came and stood beside him. She said nothing. He said nothing. They stood at the nursery door together and listened to Nell's voice and the small sounds inside. After a while she said, "You could go in." "I know," he said. "Ada is awake," she said. "She is always awake. She would like the attention." He did not move. She looked at him. She said, "Draven, they are yours. You can simply go in." He turned and looked at her, and she saw something she had not expected to see from him, something that was not the managed composure, not the investment or the warmth behind the surface, but something more exposed than that, a specific quality of uncertainty. From a man who did not express uncertainty about anything. She thought about 3 centuries of solitude, of ruling a duchy from a stone keep in the mountains, of managed distance, of being the kind of thing that most people understood in relation to fear and legend and the old stories. She thought about what it did to a person to live 300 years being primarily regarded as something to be wary of. What it did to the internal experience of something as simple as walking into a room where 3 small people had no framework, yet for being wary of anything. She said, "They have no idea what you are. They only know who you are. And who you are to them is the person in the chair by the window who was there when they woke up." He looked at her. She said, "Ada is going to need things for the next 18 years. She is going to need a very great many things, and she is going to be a great deal of work, and she is going to disagree with both of us constantly because she has already demonstrated that she does not accept situations without examining them, and that is going to be both wonderful and exhausting." She paused. "She needs you to walk into the room." He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the door and went in. She stayed in the corridor. She heard Nell say, "Good morning, Your Grace," with professional composure, and she heard the sounds of the room adjust slightly, the particular acoustic shift of a space responding to the presence of someone new. And then she heard something she had not heard before from inside the nursery, Ada, who had a very clear and confident voice for someone 12 days old, apparently deciding that the new presence warranted her full attention, because the sound she made was not distressed or uncertain but was, if Alara was reading infant vocal expression correctly, interested. She pressed her back against the wall of the corridor and looked at the ceiling. She managed herself. She was very good at managing herself. She was not managing herself as well as usual. She heard after a moment a sound that she had not heard from him before, ever, a low, quiet sound directed at Ada, saying something she couldn't quite catch. The tone of it, not the voice he used in the study or the hall or the sitting room or their conversations. Something entirely different, something private and unprepared and genuine in a way that made her close her eyes for a moment. She stood in the corridor and waited. After about 20 minutes, he came back out. He closed the door behind him. He looked at her, she looked at him. His face was doing the thing without the layer again. "She grabbed my finger," he said. "She does that," Alara said. "She has been doing it since the first day." He looked back at the door. "Elias slept through it," he said. "Elias sleeps through almost everything," she said. "It will not last. Enjoy it while it does." He looked at her. She held the look. She thought, "You have been standing in corridors long enough." She said, "Come to breakfast." He came. The weeks after that were different. Not dramatic, not the abrupt change of a scene from a story where the music shifts and everything realigns. The change was gradual, the way real changes are small adjustments in proximity, in routine, in the shape of days. Draven began spending time in the nursery. Not long stretches, he still had a duchy to manage, and she still had her reading and her correspondence and her gradually rebuilding health, but regularly, predictably. In a way that Nell stopped noting as unusual and began simply accounting for. Ada recognized his footstep before she recognized almost anyone else's. This happened at 3 weeks, and Harwick, when she told him, said it was early but not impossible, which was his most enthusiastic response to anything. Elias, who was observing everything at all times with the patient quality that seemed to be his characteristic approach, would stop moving when Draven entered the room and watch him until he left, with a focused intensity that was somewhat unnerving in a 3-week-old. Iris did something that Alara had not expected and could not entirely account for. When Draven held her, she slept. Immediately, reliably, regardless of whether she had been awake or fussy or simply doing her characteristic thoughtful assessment of the ceiling. His arms, and she was asleep within 4 minutes. This appeared to work for no one else. She had no explanation for it, neither did Harwick. Draven did not comment on it. He simply held Iris when she needed to sleep, with the careful, complete focus he gave everything. She began to think that the capacity for attentiveness that she had observed in him from the very beginning, the way he listened, the way he read, the way he looked at things as though they were worth his full investment, had perhaps been waiting, for a long time, for something specific to apply it to. She thought about 300 years of managing a duchy and fighting political battles, and looking at mountains. She thought about Ada grabbing his finger at 12 days old. She thought about the particular economy of lives that are very long and very solitary, finally finding a direction for their attention. She was in the library one afternoon when he came in and sat in the chair that was his chair now, not the chair he had once asked permission to sit in, and he did not have correspondence with him, which was unusual for an afternoon. He simply sat. She looked at him. "Something has happened," she said. "Not yet," he said. She put down her book. The Marchmont response to the second letter, he said, was different from the first. "They are positioning for negotiation." "They know you have the boy," she said. "They know I have the boy, and they suspect I have identified the candles," he said. "They no longer believe they are ahead. They are recalibrating." "Which means they will move," she said, "before you are ready." "Yes," he said. She thought about this carefully. "What do they want?" she said, in the simplest terms. "Recognition of a trade route that was closed 15 years ago," he said, "and a formal connection to the Asheville succession." She sat with formal connection to the Asheville succession. She thought about what that meant in practical terms, what shape that would take, what Marchmont would need to give it teeth. "They want something with the children," she said. "A betrothal agreement," he said, "pre-negotiated for when Ada is of age." She was very still. "No," she said. "No," he agreed. She looked at him. "Then what will you offer them?" "Nothing," he said. "I am not offering them anything." She thought about this. She thought about what nothing meant, in the language of people who had already tried to harm her and who had now been caught and who were running out of cards. "They will escalate," she said. "Yes," he said, "and I am ready for that." She looked at him. "The first letter," she said, "the one you sent, that was a signal. It told them I knew what they had done," he said, "but not how much I knew, which kept them uncertain." "The second letter," she said, "told them I was not going to negotiate, which confirmed they had overplayed their position." "And now," she said. He looked at the fire. "Now they are going to do something that will allow me to respond permanently," he said, and the compression was back in his voice, and she understood now fully what it meant. It was not anger. It was the voice of someone who has been patient for exactly as long as patience served a purpose, and who is now at the point where patience is finished. She thought about the candles. She thought about the supply chain and the 17-year-old boy and the timed congratulations and all of it. The specific architecture of people who believed that small deliberate harm could be inflicted without consequences because they had always operated that way. She thought about Ada in her crib, already 3 weeks old and already demonstrating that she intended to examine everything she encountered. She said, when it happens, tell me. I want to know what you do about it. He looked at her. Not to manage it, she said. I understand this is yours to manage. I want to know. I want to understand what happens in this duchy with the people in it when someone tries to harm this household. I am part of this household. I want to understand the shape of it. He was quiet for a long moment. I will tell you, he said. She picked up her book. He stayed. The afternoon light moved slowly across the library floor, and outside the mountains were their usual enormousness, and inside the fire burned, and she read her book, and he did not read anything, which was unusual, and she understood after a while that he was simply sitting in the same room as her in the way that people do when the room that contains another person is the room they want to be in, without any other reason required. She did not comment on this. She turned her page. The event she had been thinking of as the thing that would allow him to act happened on a Thursday in the 5th week after the birth, and it was not what she had expected. She had been imagining something similar to the candles, a covert attack, another point of household infiltration, something that moved through the household's supply chains or social channels. She had not been imagining something as direct as what actually arrived. 2 men came to the keep's front gate with papers claiming to be representatives of an unspecified legal interest. They presented documents that had been expertly forged, she learned this later, which claimed to be official instruments regarding the status of children born in the duchy, specifically regarding the rights of discovery and documentation of certain bloodline convergences. It was, in the language of the law, a fishing instrument. It was not a real claim. It was a mechanism for creating a formal record of inquiry regarding the children, Ada, Elias, and Iris, that could be used to establish Marchmont's standing to revisit the question of the succession connection they wanted. The gate guard turned them away because no one entered the keep without Draven's specific authorization. This was standard. What was not standard was that 2 men in Marchmont's employ had been willing to present themselves openly at the gate with forged instruments. This was not a cautious, careful move. This was a move made by people who had decided that caution had failed them and were now testing whether exposure would accomplish what subtlety had not. Draven told her this at dinner. She listened and thought and said, "They are afraid." "Yes," he said. "Afraid people make large moves," she said. "They have already made the largest one they can afford to make," he said. This was it. She looked at him, the forged instruments. "They are an instrument of exposure, not of legal force," he said. "They have no actual standing to make the claim they are attempting. The documents are forged, and I have the original instruments that they were forged from, which means I now have a case of documented fraud, with their men's faces recorded at the gate." She absorbed this. "They gave you what you needed," she said. "They gave me the clean response I have been waiting for," he said. "The candles, however clear the evidence, were covert. They had distance. This is not covert. This is their men at my gate, with documents that can be traced." She thought about Draven sitting in the library 4 days earlier, not reading, waiting for exactly this. "The response," she said, "what will it be?" He was quiet for a moment, not calculating. She could see that the calculation was already done. He was deciding how much to tell her. She waited. She had learned the patience of this. "Formal action through the duchy's legal structure," he said. "Criminal fraud charges, levied through the proper channels, on record, permanent." "Public," she said. "Very public," he said. "They came to my gate with forged documents. That is not a private matter that I can resolve quietly even if I wanted to. The record exists." She thought about this. She thought about the specific exposure of a house that had operated on the assumption that it could do things covertly and maintain its public position of cooperation. She thought about what public fraud charges meant for a house that had been managing its image as a cooperative southern neighbor for 15 years. "It will not destroy them," she said. "It will not," he agreed. "That is not what I am attempting. I am attempting to make it completely clear to everyone watching what the cost of moving against this household is. This is not about Marchmont specifically. It is about every house that is watching to see what happens when you try." She sat with this. She thought about 300 years of maintaining a duchy and what it took to maintain it, not just the day-to-day management, but the larger, longer work of being someone that people understood the terms of, what it meant to be Draven Asheville and to have people know across generations what the shape of him was. You have been waiting for something this clean, she said, because you needed a clean example, not just for Marchmont. He looked at her. Yes, he said. She looked at her plate. They were going to try something, she said. Whether or not we were here, the children just accelerated it. The children made the succession concrete, he said, which made the question of who controls it concrete. Which was always going to force this. So we have given them what they needed to act, she said, and now you will give them what they needed to stop. Yes, he said. She thought, I understand you. She thought, I understand how you think, and I understand why, and I understand what 300 years of this looks like from inside it. She thought, I had not expected to understand anything about this person when I was in that carriage on the road north. She said, I want to write a letter to my father. He looked up. I want to tell him what has happened, she said. The children, and what Marchmont attempted, and what you are going to do about it. I want him to understand that we are not in danger. And I want him to understand that the physician who falsely diagnosed me was in Marchmont's employ, which you now have the standing to pursue. Draven was very still. The physician, he said. He was a tool of the same house, she said. If Marchmont's fraud case goes to formal record, the physician's connection to them becomes part of the documentation. My father should know. He has lived with the guilt of the arrangement for 8 months. He should know that the physician who gave me a false diagnosis was not an independent actor, and that the false diagnosis was a structure designed to enable the debt situation, and that this is now going to be on record. He said nothing for a moment. You are asking me, he said, to include a pursuit of the physician in the formal action. I am asking you if it is possible, she said. I am not telling you it is required, I am asking. He looked at her. It is possible, he said. Then I would like you to pursue it, she said. For my father and also for myself, I spent 3 years believing I was Barren. That belief was manufactured by people who wanted leverage. I would like that to be on record as well. He said, all right. Just that, 2 words. She nodded. She picked up her fork. They finished dinner. Afterward, she went to write the letter to her father. She sat at the desk in the West Corridor room, and she wrote clearly and without excessive softening, because he was a physician and he understood how to receive honest information. And the honest information was that everything had changed, and the people responsible for the architecture of his debt were about to have that architecture exposed, and he should prepare for the conversation that was going to follow when the case was on public record. She wrote about Ada and Elias and Iris. She wrote their names. She wrote that they were healthy and present and entirely themselves, and she wrote that the keep was warm and the tea was good, and that she was, improbably and genuinely, exactly where she needed to be. She sealed the letter. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about a kitchen table and her father's hands, and the morning she had left, and what she had expected, and what had arrived instead. She thought, you did a terrible thing and a necessary thing, and you will live with the distinction forever, and you should also know that your daughter, who you handed to a man she had never met, in a stone keep in the mountains, in a transaction you could not find another way out of, is fine, is more than fine, is something that does not yet have a name. She thought, I will not write that last part in the letter, he will understand it anyway, he is a physician, he reads subtext. She set the letter with the outgoing correspondence. She went to check on the children. All 3 were sleeping. Nell was in the corner chair reading, and she looked up when Alara came in and then went back to her book with the ease of someone who had accepted that the mother of these children was going to check on them at irregular intervals and was not going to be redirected. She stood at the cradles for a while. Ada sleeping with the concentrated intensity of someone who is sleeping rather than simply resting. Elias sleeping with his usual settled patience. Iris sleeping in the particular small curled position she always chose, angled toward the warm side of the cradle. She thought, these are the 3 most important things that have ever happened to me. She thought, the physician is going to find out what his diagnosis cost, and Marchmont is going to find out what the candles cost, and my father is going to know that the debt he built his guilt on was a manufactured structure and not a moral failure. And all of this is going to happen because I married a man I did not know during a blood moon, and something in the universe apparently decided that the story had a different ending than the one I had been given. She thought, I am going to be very interested to see what comes next. She touched Iris's cheek. Iris slept on. She went back to the sitting room. Draven was there. She sat down. She picked up her book. He picked up his. The fire burned between them, and the night settled over the mountains, and the keep held them all inside its old stone warmth, and Ada and Elias and Ira slept down the corridor, and the candles burned, and the world outside did what worlds do, and inside this specific room, in this specific moment, two people sat reading by a fire as though this were something they had always done, as though there had never been a time when they hadn't. The formal case against Marchmont opened on a grey Tuesday in the 8th week after the birth, and by Friday it had become the most discussed legal action in the duchy in a decade. She did not follow the proceedings in the way that people follow things they are emotionally invested in, which would have meant watching for new developments with the kind of anxious attention that consumes the hours between developments. She followed it the way she followed everything, carefully, systematically, with a focused attention that gathered facts and held them steady and did not add to them the weight of anticipation. Draven kept her informed. This was the thing she had asked for and the thing he delivered, with a precision that she recognized as being about more than reporting. It was about them having agreed some months ago that they would speak about real things, and this was a real thing. The case was moving quickly. The forged instruments were undeniable. They had the gate records and the forged documents and the original instruments they had been copied from, and the chain of evidence was clean and well documented. The two men who had presented themselves at the gate had been identified as members of a secondary house in Marchmont's network. Their testimony, Draven explained one evening at dinner, had been more forthcoming than Marchmont would have hoped. "They are not loyal men," he said. "They were employed men. There is a difference. When the employer stops being useful, the loyalty follows," she said. "Exactly," he said. The physician's connection to Marchmont's network was established in the 3rd week of the case. The documentation trail was not as clean as the forged instruments. It was 3 years old, and people in that business were careful, but it was present. Draven had people who knew how to find what had been stored carefully. She received the summary of the documentation on a Wednesday morning. She read it at the desk in the West Corridor room with her coffee going cold beside her. She read it twice. Then she set it down. She sat for a long time. The documentation described a payment structure. The physician, whose name was Dr. Aldous Webb, which she had not known before and which now had a specific and permanent quality in her mind, had been paid a significant sum to perform a specific examination and deliver a specific finding. The finding, that Ilara Voss was barren. The purpose, to make her a viable candidate for the debt-arrangement marriage, knowing that the barrenness diagnosis would likely never be disclosed to the Asheville household, creating leverage over the arrangement once it was in place. 3 years of her life, shaped by a lie that cost someone in an office somewhere exactly what it had been worth to them to have it told. She sat with this for a very long time. She was not going to cry. She had cried about the barrenness once 3 years ago briefly, alone in her father's examination room when the physician left and she thought she was alone. She was not going to cry about it again. Not because she was trying to be composed, she had stopped performing composure for its own sake some time ago, but because what she felt was not grief. What she felt was something more specific and more useful. She picked up the document and went to find Draven. He was in the study. She came in and put the document on his desk. She stood. He looked at it, he looked at her. She said, "I want to be present when the case reaches the documentation of this." "It will be a formal proceeding," he said. "I know what it will be," she said. "I want to be present." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. She nodded. She went back to the West Corridor room and picked up her coffee and drank it cold and went back to her reading. Because she had medical texts to get through and children to attend to and a life to live. And Marchmont and Dr. Aldous Webb were going to be dealt with through proper channels. And she had done the part of it that was hers to do, which was to find the information and give it to the person who could use it. The proceeding where the physician's connection was entered into formal record happened on a Thursday. She was there. The proceeding room was smaller than she had expected, formal but not theatrical. A large table, several legal representatives, a recording official. She sat at one side with Draven, who was beside her rather than across from her, which she noted and which she thought was intentional. She did not speak during the proceeding. This was not her role. Her role was to be present, which was a role she had chosen, and she played it with the full attention she gave to everything. Dr. Aldous Webb was not present. He had not been located. His location was, according to the formal proceedings, under active investigation. She thought about this. She thought about 3 years ago, and the pale blue paint on the wall in his examination room, and the careful gentleness of his voice as he closed a door in her face with a lie. She thought about Ada grabbing Draven's finger at 12 days old, and Elias watching everything with patient assessment, and Iris sleeping against his chest at exactly 4 minutes every time. She thought Dr. Webb will be found. She thought the record will say what the record needs to say. She thought that is enough for now. The proceeding ended, the records were filed. The documentation of Marchmont's network, including its connection to the physician's diagnosis, was now formal and permanent and public. On the way back through the keep's main corridor, Draven said, "The Marchmont house has sent a formal communication." "Have they?" she said. "They are withdrawing all pending matters," he said, formally, with the specific language that signals they are closing the file and not reopening it. She stopped walking. She looked at him. "That was quick," she said. "The formal record is not something they can manage their way around," he said. "Once it is public, the calculation changes entirely. Their cooperative positioning in the duchy has depended on no public record of this kind of action. It is now not a matter of calculating risk. The risk has already materialized." She thought about all the careful architecture they had built, the physician's diagnosis, the debt arrangement, the boy in the kitchen, the candles, the forged instruments. Years of careful construction dismantled in 8 weeks. "They will try again," she said, "eventually in some form." "Yes," he said. "But not with this generation of leadership, and not soon." She thought about what "not soon" meant to a man whose operational timeline was centuries. "Good enough," she said. They walked back through the corridor. She thought about her letter to her father, which she had sent 3 weeks ago, and which had received a response last week, a response that was shorter than she expected but more precise, because her father, like her, used fewer words when the words were important. He had written that he understood. He had written that he was coming north in the spring with Clara to meet the children. She had read the letter 3 times. She had not told Draven about the spring visit. She was going to tell him tonight. She thought about Clara meeting Ada, who was now 5 weeks old and already conducting what Nell described as investigations. A 5-week-old conducting investigations, which she took to mean that Ada was fascinated by everything and was expressing this with her whole body whenever awake. She thought about what Clara would make of the keep and of Draven and of the extraordinary machinery of how Alara had ended up here. She thought that Clara was going to have a great many things to say. She was looking forward to it. That evening, after dinner, she told him about the spring visit. He was quiet for a moment. She said, "Clara is 16. She is not intimidated by anything. She will be direct with you, possibly uncomfortably so." "I am not concerned about a 16-year-old, he said. "You have not met Clara," she said. The corner of his mouth, full version. She said, "My father will want to meet the children. He will probably also want to apologize to you, which will be uncomfortable for both of you, and I am asking you in advance to allow it to be brief and then move past it." Draven looked at her. "He did what he had to do," he said. She looked at him. "He placed you in a situation that could have been harmful," he said. "He also placed you in this one." He paused. "I find that I cannot account for these 2 facts in the same way I would have 8 months ago." She understood. 8 months ago, Draven's response to the debt arrangement would have been purely analytical. The father had done a practical thing with a person, the way people do practical things with people, and the arrangement had been settled. The idea that the person in question was worth something different than the terms of the arrangement, that would not have been part of the analysis. 8 months ago. "You should tell him that," she said, "when he comes, what you just said." "It is not a conversation I am comfortable with," he said. "I know," she said. "Tell him anyway." He looked at her. "All right," he said. She picked up her book. He went back to his correspondence. Outside, the northern mountains were doing what they always did, which was being enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small human arrangements happening at their base. And the keep was warm, and the children were sleeping, and the Marchmont case was on public record, and Dr. Aldous Webb was somewhere being found, and Clara was coming in the spring with her opinions and her stubbornness and her 16-year-old assessment of the man her sister had married. And she was here in the sitting room by the fire. She read her page. She turned to the next. It was, in the simplest possible terms, a good evening. The kind of evening that does not require anything extraordinary to be exactly what you want. The kind she had not been sure she was going to have, when she counted the cracks in the marble floor on a day that felt like a ceiling coming down, and now found herself inside, with no apparent floor under it. She turned another page. She thought, I would like to tell Mrs. Allerton about this. She thought she would have been extremely pleased. She thought she would also have had a very great deal to say about Draven Asheville, and most of it would have made him uncomfortable, and he would have been quietly respectful about it, and she would have seen through the quiet respect immediately and pushed harder. She thought they would have liked each other enormously, in their entirely different ways. She turned the page. The night before Clara and her father were due to arrive, she could not sleep. This was not worry. She had stopped worrying about the things that could go wrong mostly, because she had discovered that the things she worried about and the things that actually went wrong were rarely the same things, and the energy of worrying was better directed at paying attention. She was awake not because she was afraid of tomorrow, but because she was fully aware of it, in the way you are aware of important things before they happen. She lay in the dark of the West Corridor room and listened to the Keep's night sounds and thought about the last 9 months. She thought about carriage rides and stone corridors, and a ceremony she had walked through alone, and the East Wing with its careful isolation. She thought about a library on the 3rd floor with a ring on the table from many cups set down, and a blood moon she had seen through a window and not understood for weeks, and a morning on a cold floor when the understanding had arrived with no preparation. She thought about Harwick saying 3 with the particular care of a man who is finding new vocabulary for something unprecedented. She thought about Draven's hands on the stone doorframe, and the 4 grooves she had felt vibrate through the floor, and the 9 words it had taken the 2 of them to establish that they were going to talk about real things. She thought about candles and Marchmont, and a corridor guard named Owen, and a 17-year-old boy who had been used by people who understood neither the reach of what they were doing, nor the reach of what they were reaching against. She thought about the birth, the storm, the sound of the footsteps in the passage outside barely audible back and forth for hours. She thought about Draven in the doorway of the nursery, standing at the edge of the space, waiting to decide whether to enter. She thought about frequently. She had not yet said the word that was in the file. She had been filing things for 9 months with the careful patience of someone who understands that naming a thing before it is ready is a way of getting the name wrong. She had learned this from her father, who used to say that the most dangerous moment in a diagnosis was the moment you named it before you were sure, because once you had named it, you stopped gathering information about it. She had been gathering information. She thought, I am sure. She lay in the dark and listened to the mountains and the Keep, and she thought, I am sure, and the morning is tomorrow, and Clara is coming, and my father is coming, and the children are asleep down the corridor, and Draven is in the next room, and the file is full. She thought, I will say it tomorrow. Not because she had planned to say it tomorrow specifically, but because tomorrow felt like the right shape for it, a day when the people who mattered most to her were going to be in the same place, and the Marchmont case was on public record, and the children were healthy and named and 8 weeks old and entirely themselves, and she was precisely 9 months past a carriage on a road north and a ceiling coming down. She thought tomorrow. She slept. In the morning, Clara arrived before her father. She had apparently insisted on being in the lead carriage, which tracked with what Alara knew of her. She came through the Keep's front gate and across the courtyard at a speed that the gate guard was not quite prepared for, with her red winter coat and her mother's nose and her father's stubbornness, and 8 months of compressed younger sister feeling coming with her in a way that was practically visible. Alara was in the courtyard. Clara stopped. They looked at each other. Clara said, You look good. Thank you, Alara said. You look exactly like yourself. Clara said, I have so many things to say. I know, Alara said. Come inside. They went inside. Their father came through the gate 20 minutes later, thinner than she remembered, with the quality of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had recently been told he could set some of it down but wasn't yet sure how. He stopped in the courtyard and looked at the keep, and then looked at her, and for a moment neither of them moved. She crossed the courtyard to him. She let him hold her for a long time. He held on with the particular grip of someone who has been afraid they would not get to do this again, and she let him because he had been afraid, and he had reason to have been afraid, and she was here. He said into her hair, "I am sorry." "I know," she said. "The arrangement." "Father," she said, "come and meet your grandchildren." He pulled back. He looked at her. She said 3, 8 weeks old. Their names are Ada, Elias, and Iris. He looked at her with the expression of a man whose guilt and his love and his relief are all competing for space in his face at the same time, and none of them is winning. "Come inside," she said. They went in. Draven met them in the main hall. She watched her father look at him and thought, this is the moment. This is the one I told Draven to allow to be brief and then move past. She watched her father gather himself, the physician composure reasserting itself, the straight spine, the meeting of eyes that was the quality he had passed on to her, the refusal to look away from difficult things. He said, "Your Grace, I owe you an explanation." Draven said, "You owe me nothing." Her father stopped. Draven said, "The arrangement was made under circumstances that have since been fully investigated and documented. The debt was structured by an external house to create leverage. You were a mechanism, not an architect. What you did was sign a paper in a bad situation, as people do." He paused. "Your daughter is here. Your grandchildren are here. That is what the arrangement produced. I do not require an explanation for it." Her father was quiet for a long moment. Elara watched him absorb this. She thought, "I told you to say it. I am glad you said it." Her father said, "Thank you." Draven nodded. Clara, who had been standing slightly to the side and taking all of this in with the focused attention of a 16-year-old who is missing nothing, said, "Can I see them now, the babies? I've been thinking about them for 8 weeks. Elara smiled. "Come on," she said. She took her sister up the corridor toward the nursery, and her father followed, and behind them she heard Draven say something to Mrs. Calloway about the guest rooms, and then his footsteps coming up the corridor after them, and she did not look back, but she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him now. Not anxiously, not with the careful management of proximity that she had used in the early weeks, but with the easy, settled awareness of someone who has become part of the landscape of your daily life, without either of you having made a formal announcement about it. Clara's reaction to the nursery was everything she had expected. She went straight for Ada, which was the correct instinct, and Ada responded to Clara the way Ada responded to all new things, with the focused investigation of a child who has already decided that everything is worth understanding. Clara said "oh" in a way that had nothing performative about it, and sat down with Ada in her arms and looked at her, and then looked at Elara. "She has your eyes," Clara said. "She has her own eyes," Elara said. "But the shape," Clara said, "the way she's looking at me, that's your look." She looked at Ada, who was looking at Clara with the focused assessment that was her characteristic approach to every new thing. "Perhaps," she said. Her father was holding Elias, who was awake and doing his quiet observing of everything. He looked at Elias with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years working with the bodies of the living and dying, and is now holding something that has rendered all of that prior experience inadequate as emotional preparation. Iris was being held by Draven, who had come into the nursery behind them and picked her up with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for weeks, and Iris had gone immediately to sleep at the 4-minute mark, which was her invariable response. Clara noticed. She said to Draven, with the absolute directness of someone who is 16 and has decided that directness is the only language worth speaking, "She always does that with you." "Yes," Draven said. "Why?" Clara said. He looked at the sleeping Iris. "I don't know," he said. Clara considered this. "I think she trusts you," she said. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him with the steady quality of their mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness. He said, "I think so too." Clara nodded. She returned her attention to Ada, who had reached up and grabbed her braid with the confident grip of a child who has decided that what is within reach is available to her. Elara stood in the door of the nursery and looked at the room. Clara with Ada, her father with Elias, Draven with Iris. The fire in the corner, the mountains beyond the windows, the keep around all of them. She thought, this is the room. This is the specific room that was not going to exist, that was constructed from a debt and a lie and a blood moon and 9 months of very careful, very complicated work. And here it is, full of people and small sleeping faces and the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with fireplaces. She thought, I am going to say it tonight. She leaned against the doorframe. Ada, discovering she had a handful of Clara's braid, made a sound of considerable satisfaction. Everyone in the room looked at her. And she looked back at all of them, with the focused investigative quality that was entirely her own, and appeared to find the situation entirely acceptable. She said it in the library. She had thought she might say it at dinner, or in the sitting room, or somewhere with a fire and the accumulated comfort of the ordinary evenings they had built over 9 months. But it was the library where it happened, because the library was where she had first learned him, the ring on the table, the worn spines on the shelves, the 2 chairs by the window, and so the library was the right room for the thing that was going to change what happened in the rooms after it. Clara and her father had gone to their rooms after dinner. Her father was tired from the journey. Clara was not tired but had, in a surprising display of perceptiveness, announced that she wanted to write in her journal, which Clara had never done in her life, and which was Clara's way of giving her sister the evening. She had looked at Clara as she said this, and Clara had looked back at her with an expression that was somehow both 16 and ancient simultaneously, and she thought, you see things, don't you? You always have. She went to the library. Draven came in at 8, because the library at 8 in the evening was where they both went, not by arrangement but by the settled accumulation of habit, and he sat in the chair that was his, and she sat in the chair that was hers, and the fire was burning between them, and the night was very quiet outside the mountains. She put down her book. He looked at her. She said, I want to tell you something. He was still, alert, the way he was always alert but different from his ordinary alertness, something that recognized the quality of what was coming. She said, I have been keeping a file. He waited. She said, not a written one, an internal one, of things I have noticed, things I have filed, things I have been adding to for 9 months with the specific intention of not naming them too soon. I did not want to name them before I was sure. She stopped. She made herself be precise because she was a physician's daughter and precision was her form of honesty. I am sure. He said nothing. He was giving her the room to do this at the pace she needed, which was exactly what she needed, and the fact that he knew to give it to her was itself an item in the file. I did not arrive here expecting anything, she said. You know this, I told you this months ago. I arrived prepared for nothing good, which was the most practical thing I could do given the circumstances. And I have been systematically wrong about what was going to happen in the specific direction of everything being better than I expected. She looked at him. You have been better than I expected, in every particular. He was completely still. I have been watching you, she said, since the first week because watching is how I understand things, and I have understood a great deal about you. I understand how you think and how you make decisions, and what you look like when you are about to say something difficult, and what you look like when you are saying something true, and what you look like when Iris is asleep against your shoulder at 4 in the morning. She paused. I understand that you are not the thing the stories say. You are something much more specific and much more interesting than the thing the stories say. She looked at the fire for a moment, then back at him. I love you, she said. I want to be clear and precise about that, because I am a precise person and I have spent 9 months being very careful about this specific word, and I am using it because it is the accurate word. Not an arrangement word, not a gratitude word, not a word I am using because of the children or the keep or anything external. An accurate word for an internal fact. He was very still. She said, you do not have to say anything right now. I am not placing a requirement on you. I am telling you because it is true and because I am done carrying it in a file. She picked up her book. She opened it to the page she'd been on. She did not read. She waited. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I have not said that word in 300 years. She looked up. He was looking at his hands, which were flat on the arms of the chair, and she thought, that is the most honest thing you have ever told me, which is saying something, because you have told me a great many honest things." She waited. He looked at her. "I have been," he said slowly, "in the habit of not wanting things. It is a practical habit over a long enough timeline. Things change, people leave, what you want becomes a liability." He paused. "I stopped counting on things remaining." She said nothing. "You have," he stopped, he tried again. "You have rearranged a great many of my practical habits," he said, "in the last 9 months, without, I note, asking my permission to do so." "No," she agreed. "You asked me questions," he said. "That was the first thing. You asked me questions and you expected real answers, and you gave real answers back, and you did not leave." He looked at the fire. "You have continued to not leave in the face of a great many situations that would have provided reasonable cause to do so." "I am not a person who leaves things," she said. "I know," he said. "I know that now." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know it at the beginning." She looked at him. "At the beginning," she said, "you didn't look at my face." He looked at her directly. "I know," he said. She held the look. "I look now," he said. "Yes," she said, "you do." He said, "I have been looking for some months." "I know," she said, "I noticed." The corner of his mouth, something more than the corner. She thought, this is what the ending looks like. Not a theatrical ending, not the kind from the old stories with their dramatic gestures and declarations and final scenes. This kind of ending, which is not an ending at all but a particular point in an ongoing thing, where two people sit in a library at night with a fire between them and say things that have been true for some time, and finally take up the space in the air that they were always going to need. He said, "I do not have the practice with this." "I know," she said. "I have more practice than you do by approximately 300 years, and I am still not particularly skilled at it. We will both manage." He looked at her for a long moment. "Alara," he said, 5th time. Each time he used her name there was something different in it, and this time there was no layer at all between the name and whatever was behind it. "Yes," she said. He said, "I love you." The 3 words came out with the careful quality of someone choosing something weighty, not because the feeling was uncertain, but because the word was important and he was treating it accordingly. "I am not going to be particularly graceful about it. I have not had occasion to be graceful about it in a very long time, and I suspect I am going to need adjustment time for the practical aspects of it." She thought about what the practical aspects meant for a man whose practical aspect of love had not been exercised in 3 centuries. She thought about warm rooms and 2 chairs, and the way he positioned himself in corridors and guard rotations, and lemon water on a bedside table and Iris sleeping at 4 minutes, and the footsteps in the passage during a storm that lasted 6 hours. She thought, "You have been doing the practical aspects since the 3rd week, actually. You have simply not been calling them by a name." She said, "You have been managing the practical aspects very well." He looked at her. "Have I?" "Remarkably so," she said, "for someone who claims no practice." The expression on his face was fully present now, the warmth she had learned to see in pieces, whole, with nothing between it and the air in the room. She thought, "There you are." She thought, finally. She set down her book. She said, "Come and sit over here." He came and sat in the chair beside her instead of across from her, which he had not done before, and the distance between them was different than it had been for 9 months, which was the right amount of different. She said, "Tell me something I don't know." "About what?" he said. "About you," she said, "something old, something from before." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I used to walk the North Tower at night, before it became unsafe. You could see 3 mountain ranges from the top window on a clear night. I used to go up and look at them when the duchy was quiet and I had no immediate problems to manage." He paused. "I had not gone in 40 years before you arrived. I did not think about it. You asked about the North Tower on your 1st week, and I told you it was closed, and I thought about it afterward, that it had been 40 years. She looked at him. "What changed it?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "Things that have been the same for a long time sometimes simply change, without a specific cause you can point to." She thought about this. She thought, yes. She thought about things that have been the same for a long time suddenly simply changing, without a specific cause, just a blood moon and a carriage and a woman who asked questions and did not leave. "The North Tower," she said, "we should fix the stairs." He looked at her. "Why?" Because I want to see 3 mountain ranges from the top window, she said. He was quiet for a moment. In the spring, he said, when the ground is better for construction. In the spring, she agreed. Outside, the northern mountains were there as they always were. Enormous, white, permanent. The kind of thing that makes everything at its base feel small and temporary and brief. She did not feel small. She had not felt small in some time in this particular building, and she had come to understand that this was not about the building. The fire burned. Down the corridor, all 3 children slept. In the morning, Clara would come to breakfast and say the 17 things she had been composing overnight, and their father would come in with the posture of a man who had set something down, and Mrs. Calloway would bring the excellent tea, and Harwick would come at 10 to check on the children, and Nell would have the plate on the table, and Owen would be at the end of the corridor, and the mountains would be outside, and the day would be the day. All of it the ordinary accumulation of a life that had not been planned for and had arrived anyway. She looked at the fire. She thought about the specific shape of what she had expected 9 months ago in a carriage on a road north, looking forward because she always looked forward. She thought, I was looking in the right direction. She just had not known how far forward she was looking. She sat beside him in the library, in the chair that was hers, in the room that had been here a long time and would be here a long time after, and the fire burned between the 2 chairs, and outside the night was cold and clean and full of stars over the mountains, and she was exactly where she was, which was, improbably and permanently, where she needed to be. She did not need to name anything else. The file was closed. In the morning, things were as they always were, and also completely different, which is the paradox of the morning after something important. The world does not look dramatically changed, and yet the person moving through it is changed, and so everything they see is seen through that change, and it amounts to a different world. She woke at her usual early hour. She lay in the dark for a moment, and the first thing she thought about was not anything that had happened the previous night. The first thing she thought about was Ada, specifically whether Ada had slept through, which she sometimes did now and sometimes did not, depending on factors that remained mysterious even to Harwick. She listened. The corridor was quiet. Ada had slept through. She got up and dressed and brought herself to the library at 5 in the morning, because this was her hour, the one the household was not yet occupying, and she sat in the chair that was hers and read, and the fire had been built up by some member of the household who understood by now that the library was the first room to need fire in the morning, and the light came up slowly through the tall windows, and she read 3 chapters before the sound of the household coming to life began to reach the room. Draven came in at 6. He came in and sat in the chair beside her, not across from her, the chair that was now his evening chair, which was also his morning chair. She noticed this in the way she noticed everything, and she did not comment on it. He had his correspondence. She had her book. They sat. After a while she said, Ada slept through. Yes, he said without looking up from the paper he was reading. She shifted at 3 but did not wake. Elias woke briefly. Iris did not wake at all. She looked at him. He had been listening at 3 in the morning. He had been awake, as he always was, and he had been listening to the sounds of 3 children sleeping or not sleeping down the corridor, and he knew, with the specificity of someone paying attention, which of them had stirred at what hour. She thought about this. She thought about the practical aspects of love, which he had claimed no practice with, and which he was apparently conducting with complete competence. She turned back to her book. She did not say anything about it. She did not need to. Clara appeared at breakfast with the expression of someone who had a great many observations they have been organizing overnight, and she sat down across from Alara and accepted her tea and looked at Draven, and then looked at her sister, and then looked at Draven again. She said to Draven, "My sister is extremely difficult to know." Draven said, "I am aware." Clara said, "She doesn't ask for things. She waits to see if you'll notice, and then she either figures it out herself or she goes without." Alara said, "This is a rather direct analysis." "I've been living with you for 16 years, Clara said. "I have data." She looked at Draven, who was looking at Clara with an expression that contained, she thought, a layer of recognition, the expression of a person who is hearing a thing described that they have themselves observed. He said, "Yes." Clara said, "Good, you've noticed." She turned to her breakfast. Ilara looked at her sister. She thought, "You are going to be absolutely formidable when you are older." She thought, "I cannot wait." Her father came down to breakfast with the careful quality of a man who has had a long night of thinking, the specific quality of someone reorganizing an understanding that has been very wrong for a long time and adjusting to the weight of what the correct version feels like. He sat. He looked at the table with the expression she knew well, the physician composure, the straight spine, the meeting of things straight on. He looked at Draven. He said, "I want to tell you what I know about what Marchmont arranged." Draven said, "I have the documentation." "The documentation tells you the mechanics," her father said. "I want to tell you what it was like from inside." Draven was quiet for a moment. He said, "All right." Her father told him. He told him about the debt, which had started small and had been structured to grow in a specific direction, in a way that he had understood too late was not accidental. He told him about the physician, whose name he said with the specific quietness of a man who had worked alongside someone for 15 years and had trusted them, and who had learned what that trust had cost. He told him about the contract and the 4 days and the carriage, and what he had known and what he had not told, and what he had told himself about the distinction. He told it plainly, without excusing it, in the manner of a physician who has learned that the accurate account is the only useful one. Draven listened. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interruption, with the complete attention that was perhaps the most distinctive thing about him. When her father finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "The debt was a constructed liability. You understood this after the fact, but by then the contract was signed. You did not have options that were not harmful." He paused. "You chose the option that harmed the fewest people who were entirely innocent." Her father said, "It harmed Ilara." "Yes," Draven said, "it placed her in a situation that could have been very bad. It was not." He looked at the table for a moment. "I am not in a position to tell you that the decision was without consequence. I am telling you that the consequence is what is in this room." Her father looked at the room, at Clara, who was eating her breakfast with the focused attention of someone tracking a conversation for later processing. At Ilara, who was looking at him with the direct quality she had had since she was small, the one he had first seen in her at the age of 4 when she asked him why sick people didn't always get better, a question he hadn't known how to answer. At Draven, who was telling him, in the precise economy of a very old and very careful man, that what he had done was not unforgivable. Her father said, "Thank you." Draven nodded. Clara said, without looking up from her plate, "I think this went well." Ilara looked at her. "For what it was," Clara added. She thought, yes, for what it was. She thought about her file, which was closed, and which she was not going to reopen, because the things in it had been said now and had taken up their proper space in the air and could stop being carried. She thought about 9 months of careful, difficult, extraordinary work, not the grand dramatic work of the old stories, not fire and battle and magic, but the harder work of 2 people becoming real to each other in the specific and complicated way that real means when you start as strangers and end as something else. She thought about 3 healthy children sleeping down the corridor. She thought about North Tower stairs and spring construction and 3 mountain ranges on a clear night. She thought about all of it. She picked up her tea. It was very good tea, as it always was, and she was no longer surprised by this, because she had stopped being surprised by good things here some months ago and had simply incorporated them into what the place was. Which was, she thought, the correct adjustment, the one that happens when somewhere stops being a destination and becomes a home. She drank her tea. Outside, the mountains were there. She did not need to look at them. She knew they were there. They had been there every morning she had been in this place, and they would be there every morning she could imagine, and at some point the certainty of a thing becomes simply background, simply the air you breathe and the ground under your feet, simply the shape of everything. She thought, this is the shape of everything. She thought, I walked into this place with 2 warm coats and medical books and my mother's box and a policy of looking forward, and what I found was everything the East Wing's isolation did not want me to find, and everything the candles were meant to prevent me from reaching, and everything that Mrs. Allerton, who saw things in people with the infuriating accuracy of the very wise, had apparently seen in her before she had seen it in herself. She thought she was right. She set down her cup. She looked across the table. Draven was looking at her. The expression on his face was the one she had first fully seen on the morning after the birth, in the chair by the window, the one without any layer between it and the world. She had come to understand over the months since then that this was not a rare expression from him. It had become his expression when he looked at her, the default, the one he didn't put anything over. She thought that took 300 years. She thought, I will not take it for granted. She looked back at him with the expression that was hers, the direct one, the one her father had first seen when she was 4, the one that meant she was looking at something worth looking at and intended to keep looking. She thought, we are both going to need quite a lot of adjustment time. She thought, that is exactly right. The breakfast table had their whole family at it now, and the sound of the keep in its morning mode was all around them, and the children were beginning to wake down the corridor, and Mrs. Calloway would be in shortly, and Clara was composing more observations, and her father was allowing himself to sit in a room he had been afraid to sit in, and the mountains were outside and the day was beginning. She picked up her fork. She ate her breakfast. The east wing sat empty at the far end of the building, with its careful furniture and its 2 sets of heavy doors and its long quiet corridor, and nobody asked whose room it was, and nobody was going to because the answer was no one's, and the person it had been prepared for was no longer in it, and the distance it had been designed to maintain had been reduced, over 9 months of real conversation and honest work, to nothing at all.